The wagon wheel hit a frozen rut, and the whole rig shuddered hard enough to rattle Eleanor's back teeth together. She grabbed the sideboard with one hand and reached across with the other to steady the bundle in her lap. Little Rosie, 6 years old, and burning with a fever that had started 3 days back and hadn't let up since. "Mama." That was Thomas, 14, sitting beside her on the bench with the reins in his hands. He'd been driving since noon when Eleanor's arms gave out. He was trying to sound steady, but she could hear the worry underneath it, thin as ice over a creek in early winter. "There's a town ahead. I can see smoke." Eleanor squinted through the gray late afternoon light. Sure enough, past the bare-limbed trees and the rolling white nothing of the valley floor, she could make out the dark smudge of buildings against the sky. A church steeple. She marked it more by shape than meaning. A water tower. The low geometry of storefronts pressed together for warmth. Blackstone Valley. She'd been saying the name to herself for 6 weeks, the whole long journey from Missouri. Blackstone Valley. Blackstone Valley. Like if she said it enough times, it would start to feel like something real, something safe. Now that it was actually in front of her, all she felt was tired. Too tired even for relief. "Keep going," she said. "Don't stop until we're on the main street." Behind her in the wagon bed, she could hear the other 8 sorting themselves out. Caleb, 15, and the oldest after Thomas, though he'd argue about that depending on the day. Agnes, 12, perpetually put upon, currently trying to keep 7-year-old James from dangling his arm over the side. The 4 younger ones, Hannah and George and May and little Daniel, had been a mass of tangled limbs and complaints for most of the afternoon, but they'd gone quiet now, pressing up to look between the wagon slats at the town coming toward them. Children always went quiet when something new was about to happen. Eleanor had learned that years ago. It was one of the few mercies of their curiosity. It gave her a moment to think. What she was thinking right now was, I don't know this man. She knew the letter. She'd read it so many times the creases had gone soft. My name is Gideon Cross. I own 1,200 acres in Blackstone Valley territory. Cattle operation working well. I am in need of a wife, and you appear to be in need of a situation. I am not a young man, and I make no pretense of romance. But I'm able-bodied, I do not drink, and any children you bring will be fed and housed and treated decently. If this arrangement suits you, write back before November and come before the snow closes the mountain pass. It had suited her. She'd written back, and here she was. The wagon rolled into Blackstone Valley at 4:30 in the afternoon, the light already going amber and thin, and the first thing Eleanor noticed was the cold. Not just the temperature, she'd been cold for weeks, but something else. Something that settled over the main street the way fog settles over water. Thick and gray and hard to see through. The second thing she noticed was the people. There weren't many of them out at this hour, but the ones who were had stopped what they were doing. A woman in a heavy coat outside the general store, a paper-wrapped bundle in her arms, had gone completely still. 2 men talking near the livery stable had turned to watch the wagon pass. A boy no older than Thomas, sweeping a wooden sidewalk in front of what looked like a barber shop, had stopped mid-stroke and was staring openly. Eleanor was used to being looked at. A woman traveling alone with 9 children drew attention wherever she went. But this was different. This wasn't the curious look of people watching something unusual. This was the look of people watching something they recognized, something that concerned them. She sat up straighter on the bench. "Thomas," she said quietly, "keep moving. Don't make eye contact." "Why?" James had heard her from the wagon bed and was already squirming forward to look. "Why can't we make eye contact? Mama, is something—" "James Hartwell, sit back down." He sat. The wagon rolled on. More people noticed them. A woman hanging laundry in the thin, cold air, who went still with a pair of trousers half pinned to the line. An older man in a hat who came to the window of the saloon, not to wave, just to watch. And the watching had a quality to it that Eleanor couldn't quite name. Not hostility, exactly. Not welcome either. Something in between. The look of people who knew something about where this wagon was headed and weren't sure whether to say so. She was still trying to work out what it meant when she heard the horse. It came around from the side street. A big dark bay, well kept, moving at a controlled canter, and the rider pulled up alongside the wagon without calling out. Just drew level and stayed there, matching Thomas's pace. Eleanor turned to look, He was older than she'd expected, though she realized now she hadn't expected anything in particular. Somewhere in his 50s, she would have guessed. A hard-worked 50, the kind that showed in the set of a man's jaw and the weathering of his hands, wide through the shoulders. Not tall in the saddle so much as solid. His hat was plain. His coat was heavy canvas lined with something dark. He had a face that had been lived in hard and put away without being dried out by it, which was less common than people liked to think. He was looking at Rosie. "The child is sick," he said. It wasn't a question. "She has a fever." Eleanor kept her voice even. "It started 3 days ago." He looked at Eleanor then, and she looked back. This was the part she'd been dreading, without knowing she was dreading it. The actual moment of seeing each other, of the arrangement becoming a person. "Gideon Cross," he said. "Eleanor Hartwell." A beat passed. He nodded, once, the way a man nods when he's acknowledged something he's not ready to name yet. "I've got a woman at the ranch," he said. "Came up from the Pueblo last spring, knows something about medicine. She can look at the girl when we get there." He glanced at the line of children visible between the wagon slats. "How many did you say in the letter?" 9. He looked at the wagon again, looked at Eleanor. "All right," he said, and turned the bay toward the far end of town. It was the most inadequate response she could have imagined, and also, she realized as she let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding, somehow exactly right. They were almost clear of town when it happened. A man stepped off the wooden sidewalk directly into the path of the wagon. Not threatening. He didn't reach for anything, didn't raise his voice, just stepped into the street and held up one hand. Thomas pulled the horse to a stop before Eleanor could say anything. The man was well dressed for a frontier town. A good coat, a decent hat, boots that didn't have mud worked permanently into the leather. He was Eleanor's age, perhaps a year or two older, somewhere around 40, with a carefully trimmed beard and the kind of clean-shaved face under it that said he had access to a real barber on a regular basis. His eyes were gray, or something close to gray. Light-colored, anyway. They went to Gideon first, and then to Eleanor. "Mr. Cross." His voice was cordial. Professionally cordial. The kind of cordial that had been practiced until it stopped meaning anything. "I hadn't heard you were expecting company." "Wasn't your business to hear," Gideon said. The man smiled. It didn't reach the gray eyes. "No, of course not." He looked at Eleanor. "Forgive me, ma'am. I don't believe we've been introduced. I'm Victor Blackwell. I serve as judge for this territory." Eleanor's hands were cold inside her gloves. She made herself nod pleasantly. "Eleanor Hartwell. I'm told I'll be Mrs. Cross shortly." Something moved across Blackwell's expression and was gone before she could read it. "Well," he said, "that is something." He looked past her into the wagon bed, at the row of children watching him with the frank unselfconsciousness of kids who haven't yet learned that staring is rude. Something in his face went very still. "Quite a family," he said. "Yes," Eleanor said. "We think so." Another moment, just a hair too long, and then Blackwell stepped back onto the sidewalk. "Welcome to Blackstone Valley, Mrs. Hartwell. I do hope your stay is comfortable." His eyes moved to Gideon. "And uneventful." Gideon said nothing. He turned the bay and rode, and Thomas clucked at the horse and the wagon rolled after him. Nobody spoke for a while. Then Caleb, from behind her, said quietly, "Mama, who was that man?" "A judge," Eleanor said. "Why did he look at Mr. Cross like that?" Eleanor kept her eyes on the road ahead. "I don't know yet." Gideon's ranch was 4 miles south of town, down a road that was more suggestion than fact in the fading winter light. Eleanor sat with Rosie pressed against her side and watched the land open up around them. Rolling fields gone pale under old snow, a dark line of trees along the western edge, and then the buildings themselves coming into view at the end of a long, flat drive. A main house, 2 stories, built with the kind of care that said someone had once wanted it to last. Bunkhouse to the east. Barn with a weather vane shaped like a horse. Fencing that had been maintained. It was more than she had let herself imagine. She hadn't dared to imagine too much. Gideon reined up in the yard and dismounted without ceremony. He called into the barn and a boy of about 16 appeared. Ranch hand, she guessed, moving with the easy efficiency of someone who'd been doing outdoor work since he was young. and took the bay's reins. "Get the wagon horse seen to," Gideon said. He was already walking toward the front door of the house. "And let Marta know she's needed." The boy glanced at the wagon, at the 9 children currently piling out of it with the pent-up energy of people who'd been sitting still for 6 hours, and his face went through something complicated. Then he nodded and went to do as he was told. Eleanor climbed down from the bench. Her legs felt wrong after so long in the cold, stiff, and unreliable, and she would have stumbled if Thomas hadn't appeared at her elbow. She steadied herself against the wagon wheel and stood up straight. "All right," she said to the children, because someone had to say something. "This is where we're going to live. Be polite. Don't touch anything you haven't been told you can touch. Agnes, keep hold of Daniel." "I always keep hold of Daniel," Agnes said with the righteousness of a 12-year-old who is technically correct. "Keep holding him then." Gideon had stopped at the front door and was waiting. Not impatiently. He didn't seem like a man who wasted energy on impatience, but waiting. Eleanor walked toward him with Rosie in her arms, the child heavy and hot against her chest, and when she reached the steps, he held the door open. "It's warm inside," he said. It was. The front room had a fire going in the stone hearth, and the warmth after the frozen afternoon hit Eleanor like something physical. She heard one of the younger children make a sound behind her. Not quite a word, just a sound. And she understood it completely. She felt the same thing. The particular relief of warmth when you'd been cold so long you'd stopped noticing it. A woman came through from the back of the house, short and sturdy, somewhere past 50, with dark hair streaked gray and the capable hands of someone who'd spent a lifetime making herself useful. She looked at Eleanor and then immediately at Rosie, and her face sharpened in a way that said she knew what she was looking at. "The fever?" she said. 3 days, Eleanor said. "She drank water this morning, but not much. She's been sleeping more than she should." The woman, Marta, held out her arms and Eleanor passed Rosie over without hesitation, which surprised her a little. She didn't let people handle her children easily, but something in the way Marta moved made it feel safe. "I'll put her in the back room where it's quieter," Marta said. "You come when the others are settled." She carried Rosie away through a doorway, and Eleanor stood in the middle of someone else's front room with 8 children filing in behind her and a stranger watching from near the fireplace, and tried to figure out what came next. Gideon was watching her work it out. She had the sense he was observant in the way that quiet men often are, not missing much, not commenting on most of it. "There are 4 rooms upstairs," he said. "I've had them prepared. The oldest 2 boys can take one, the girls another, the younger children the third." He paused. "I've been in the front room down here. There's a room at the back of the house that was—" He stopped. Started again. "That's been empty. You can have that one." She noticed the stop, filed it away. "Thank you," she said. "That's more space than we've had in a long time." He nodded. He was looking at the children now, who were looking back at him with a range of expressions. James openly curious, Agnes cautiously suspicious, little Hannah pressing herself into Eleanor's side with her thumb nearly in her mouth, despite being old enough to know better. Thomas had stationed himself slightly in front of his mother. Not obviously, but Eleanor noticed. She noticed a lot of things about her children that other people didn't. "The kitchen is through there," Gideon said. "Marta can feed them when she's done with the girl." He looked at Eleanor again. "The ceremony can wait until the girl is better. The circuit preacher comes through in—" "We don't need to discuss the ceremony tonight," Eleanor said. He looked at her. She looked back. Something in his face shifted. Not annoyance, not relief. Something else that she couldn't read yet. "All right," he said. Dinner was venison stew, which Marta produced from what seemed like nothing in under an hour, and cornbread from a pan that had been warming on the back of the stove. Eleanor sat the children at the long kitchen table and watched them eat. They were quiet at first, the quiet of people who weren't sure of the rules yet, who were eating carefully in a stranger's house, and then gradually the noise came back. James asked if there were horses in the barn. Hannah spilled broth on her sleeve and looked at Eleanor in horror, and then in relief when Eleanor just handed her a cloth without a word. George and May began a whispered argument about something that had happened 2 days ago in the wagon and had apparently never been resolved. Normal sounds. Eleanor felt something in her chest loosen slightly. She looked across the table at Gideon, who was eating without apparent awareness of the chaos around him. Or not unawareness, more like a man who had adapted his awareness to exclude noise he couldn't control. He caught her looking, and something in his expression asked a question. "They're fine," she said quietly. "They're always like this." "I know," he said, which surprised her. "I had brothers." She waited for him to say something more, but he went back to his stew. After dinner, she helped Marta settle the children into rooms and spent a long time sitting beside Rosie's bed in the back room, watching the child breathe. Marta had gotten something into her, willow bark and warm water, she said, and the child had gone back to sleep with a little more color than before, still sick, but not worse. Eleanor sat in the chair beside the bed and let the quiet settle over her. Through the wall, she could hear the muffled sounds of the children getting ready for bed. Thomas's voice saying something firm to James, which meant James was doing something he shouldn't. She should probably go intervene. She would. In a minute. She was still sitting there, not quite asleep, when she heard a soft knock at the door. "Come in." Gideon opened the door and stood in the frame. He looked at Rosie and then at Eleanor. "Marta says she'll be all right," he said. "I think so too." Eleanor straightened in the chair. "Thank you for sending for the woman, for having her here." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I need to tell you something, before tomorrow, before you decide anything." Eleanor looked at him. He came into the room, careful to leave the door open, which she noted because it was either courtesy or habit or something else entirely, and sat in the other chair near the window. He put his elbows on his knees and looked at his hands. "The people in town," he said, "the way they looked at us. I noticed. You'll hear things." He paused. "You'll hear them said different ways by different people, but they'll all come down to the same thing, that my wife died and I had something to do with it." Eleanor was quiet. "Her name was Clara," he said. "We were married 11 years. She was—" He stopped, started more carefully. "She was not a woman who could let things alone. If something wasn't right, she had to know why, and then she had to try to fix it." He was silent for a moment. "She found out that some of the men who ran things in this territory, men in positions of authority, had been taking land from people, from homesteaders mostly, families who didn't have the resources to fight back. She started writing things down, names, dates, what she knew about how it worked. But Eleanor was watching him. His voice was level, but the level was deliberate. She could hear the effort in it. "She died in November 2 years ago," he said. "They said it was an accident, a fall." He looked up then and met Eleanor's eyes. "The sheriff did an investigation and found no evidence of foul play, which was not a surprise because the sheriff is one of the men whose name was in her papers." A long silence. "And the papers," Eleanor said. "Hidden. I don't know where she hid them. She kept it from me, I think because she was afraid, not for herself, for me. She thought if I didn't know, I couldn't be made to say." He exhaled. She underestimated how far they'd go. Eleanor thought of the man on the main street. The gray eyes and the careful smile and the word uneventful laid down like a stone. "Judge Blackwell," she said. Gideon's jaw tightened. "Among others." "He's the one who leads it?" "He's the one with the authority to make it legal. The others, they have money, land, guns. But Blackwell makes it stick. He decides what the law says in this territory, and he decides what gets investigated and what doesn't." Eleanor sat with all of this for a moment. Outside the window, the night was black and cold, and somewhere out in the dark there was a ranch full of children who had followed her here because they didn't have anywhere else to go. She had not come here for a conspiracy. She had not come here to take on the judiciary of a frontier territory. She had come here to get her children through the winter, and then through the next one, and the one after that. She looked at Gideon Cross, the stranger, this man she'd agreed to marry through a letter, and thought about what a woman with 9 children and almost no options actually had the luxury of doing about any of this. "Why are you telling me?" she said. "You could have waited. I might have heard rumors in town and thought nothing of them." "Because you're not stupid," he said, "and because you'd figure it out anyway, and because—" He stopped. "Because you came here with those children trusting that I was what I said I was. You deserve to know what you're actually walking into." She thought about that for a long time. "Who else knows?" she said finally. About what Clara found. I know what she was doing. I don't know what she found specifically or where the proof is. He looked at the window. There may have been others, she told. A friend in town, maybe. Someone she trusted. And Blackwell knows you don't have the papers. He knows I haven't used them. He can't be sure I don't have them, which is, he let that hang, which is part of why he leaves me alone. Mostly. Eleanor looked down at Rosie, who was breathing slower now, more deeply, the medicine doing its work. My children, she said, if I stay, if we go through with this arrangement, they're part of this too. Yes, Gideon said. He didn't dress it up. They are. She appreciated that. She had no patience left for things being dressed up. Tell me, she said, everything you know. From the beginning, don't leave anything out because you think I can't manage it. He looked at her. That will take a while, he said. Rosie's asleep and I'm not tired, Eleanor said. Start talking. He talked for nearly 2 hours. He told her about the land disputes that had started, as best he could trace, about 8 years ago. Small homesteaders, mostly. Families who'd come out on the government's land grant program. People who'd filed the right papers and worked the land and done everything they were supposed to do. Slowly, quietly, they'd begun to lose their claims. Not through violence, not usually, through paperwork. Surveys that came back with different borders than the originals. Land office records that had been amended or lost or simply ignored. Legal judgments from a territorial court that consistently found against the homesteaders and for the larger interests. Blackwell's court. He told her about the money. How the land once obtained was being sold or leased to a small group of investors who had connections back east. Men who never came anywhere near Blackstone Valley, but who were profiting from it. He named 3 names he knew. There were likely more. He told her about Clara. She had been the one to see the pattern first, he said. He'd seen pieces of it, had his own suspicions, but Clara had a mind for systems, for how things connected, and she had put it together in a way he hadn't managed. She'd spent a year, maybe more, quietly gathering evidence, talking to the families who'd lost their land, finding the papers that didn't match up, building the case. She'd been careful. Gideon thought she'd been careful enough. He'd been wrong. The morning they found her, he said, I was at the south pasture with 2 of the hands, mending fence. I'd been there since first light. 3 witnesses. His voice was flat in the way that voices go flat when emotion has been stripped out of them by repetition, by having to say a thing so many times it stops feeling like a real thing. It didn't matter. The story was already in place before I got back to the house. Who told the story? Blackwell himself came to tell me. That was the part that he stopped. He came personally, said he'd heard from one of the ranch hands that there'd been an accident. He was already organizing the inquiry before I'd had time to... He pressed his hand over his mouth briefly. Let it drop. He was very kind about it, said all the right things, and the whole time I knew he was watching me, waiting to see what I'd do. Eleanor thought about the gray eyes on the main street, the kindness in them that didn't go anywhere. What did you do? Nothing, he said. That was the choice I made. Because the moment I made a move, the moment I said anything publicly, they'd have the excuse they needed. And without Clara's evidence, without something, I had no ground to stand on. He looked at his hands, so I kept quiet and kept the ranch running and waited. For what? He was quiet for a moment. I don't know. Something to change, some angle I hadn't seen. He looked up at her. And then I got a letter from an agency in Missouri saying there was a widow woman with 9 children who needed a situation. Eleanor sat with that. You didn't think about the risk, she said, of bringing someone else into this. I thought about it, he said. I told myself it wasn't my business anymore, that Clara's evidence was gone and Blackwell had won and all I could do was run my ranch and outlast him. A pause. I don't think I ever actually believed that. She understood that. The thing you tell yourself and the thing you actually believe were very different animals. And sometimes you could hold both of them at the same time without noticing the contradiction until something forced you to look. I need to think, she said. Of course. Not about whether to stay, she added. We're staying. We don't have anywhere else to go, and it's December, and Rosie is sick. She met his eyes. I'm thinking about what comes next, about what we do. He looked at her for a long moment. We, he said, You said you needed a wife. I'm guessing you meant more than someone to run the house. Eleanor, I have 9 children who need a safe place to live, she said. And from what you're telling me, this place isn't safe unless Blackwell has a reason to leave you alone. Right now, the reason is that he thinks you might have the evidence and he doesn't want to push you into using it. She kept her voice even, thinking out loud. If he figures out you don't have it, that reason goes away. Yes, Gideon said carefully. So we need to either find the evidence or give him a reason to believe you have it. She paused. And in the meantime, we need to know everything Clara knew, everyone she talked to, every piece of the pattern she put together. Gideon was looking at her the way she'd occasionally seen people look at her since Robert died, with something between surprise and a kind of assessment, recalibrating what they'd assumed. You came here with 9 children and $4, he said, and you're sitting in a stranger's house at midnight working out how to take on a corrupt judge. Someone has to, Eleanor said. And my children are here now, which means my children's safety is here, which means I don't have the option of not working it out. A long silence. Then Gideon said, There was a woman in town, Annalisa Brenner. She and Clara were friends, close friends. If Clara told anyone what she knew, it would have been Annalisa. I'll need to meet her. She runs the post office. You'll have a reason to go in. Eleanor nodded. She looked down at Rosie again, at the child's flushed face and slow-moving chest. She'll be better in a few days, she said. We can go to town then. She looked up at him. Get some sleep. There'll be time to plan in the morning. He stood up. He paused at the door. You should know, he said, that what you're talking about is dangerous. What happened to Clara? I know what happened to Clara, Eleanor said. I'm asking you to help me make sure it doesn't happen to anyone else in this house. He looked at her. Just for a moment, something moved across his face that she couldn't fully read. Something old and tired and complicated that had been there longer than she'd known him, which was only one day, and already she felt she'd known him longer than that. All right, he said. She listened to his footsteps move down the hall. Then she turned back to her daughter, and the fire in the grate settling low, and the particular cold that came in around window frames no matter how well they were chinked. She sat there in the quiet and let herself think about Robert, just briefly, just a moment, and then she set him aside the way she'd learned to do. Not forgotten, just set aside because there was too much ahead of her to spend time looking back. Blackstone Valley. She'd been saying the name for 6 weeks. Now she was going to have to figure out what it meant to make it hers. Rosie's fever broke on the 3rd morning. Eleanor was there when it happened. She'd been there most of the night, dozing in the chair beside the bed, with her coat pulled over her shoulders, waking whenever the child shifted or made a sound. Around 4 in the morning, she woke to find Rosie watching her with clear eyes and asking, in a small voice that carried an edge of complaint, whether there was anything to eat. Eleanor put her forehead down on the edge of the bed and breathed. Yes, she said, when she could trust her voice. There's plenty to eat. She carried Rosie to the kitchen herself, wrapped in a quilt, and sat with her while Marta heated broth and sliced bread and pretended not to notice that Eleanor's hands were unsteady. The older woman had a gift for that kind of discretion, for seeing things and knowing when not to name them. Eleanor had noticed it from the first night and was grateful for it now. By the time the other children came downstairs in various states of wakefulness, Rosie was sitting up on her own and eating bread, and the general mood of the household shifted in the way it always did when the worst thing you'd been afraid of quietly stepped aside. James declared that Rosie looked like a ghost, which earned him a look from Agnes and a scowl from Rosie herself, which was perhaps the best sign of all. Gideon came in from the barn while they were all still at the table. He stopped in the doorway, looked at the scene, and then looked at Eleanor. Better? She said. He nodded and poured himself coffee and sat at the far end of the table without another word. But she noticed that he ate slower than usual that morning, like a man who'd been waiting for something and could afford to stop rushing now that it had come. She was beginning to understand something about him. He wasn't a man who said things he didn't need to say. It made him seem cold to people who didn't know how to read the silences. But Eleanor had lived with a talker for 15 years. Robert had filled every room he walked into with sound. And the contrast was strange, but not unwelcome. There was something restful about a man who didn't perform. Over the next 3 days, she learned the rhythms of the ranch. The hands, 4 of them, not counting the boy Owen, who managed the barn, kept to their own routine, and gave Eleanor and the children a wide berth that was polite rather than cold. The eldest among them, a weathered man named Cord, who she guessed was somewhere past 60, had a way of appearing at useful moments to move something heavy or explain how a piece of equipment worked, and then disappearing again before she had to figure out what to say to him. She appreciated that too. The house itself was larger than it had looked from outside. The kitchen was well stocked. Marta kept it that way, had kept it that way through the 2 years since Clara's death, a fact she mentioned once and didn't belabor. The front room had the big hearth and enough space for the children to spread out in the evenings. Upstairs, the 4 rooms held the various collections of children with approximately as much success as could be expected, which is to say there were territorial disputes and occasional loud noises, and at least one incident involving James and a window that Eleanor decided not to investigate too closely. The back room that Gideon had given her was small and plain. A bed, a washstand, a chest of drawers, a single window looking out toward the south pasture. She noticed that the walls were very clean in one spot near the window. Cleaner than the rest, the kind of clean that comes from something having been taken down and the mark beneath it scrubbed away. She didn't ask about it. On the 4th morning, Rosie declared herself completely recovered and requested to see the horses. Eleanor allowed it under Thomas's supervision and spent the resulting quiet hour sitting at the kitchen table with Marta and the remains of the breakfast coffee. "Tell me about Clara," she said. Marta didn't look up from the bread dough she was working. "What do you want to know?" "What she was like, what kind of woman she was." A pause. Marta's hands kept moving. "Why?" "Because I'm living in her house," Eleanor said. "And because her husband told me something about what she was doing before she died, and I want to understand who was doing it." Marta was quiet for a while after that, long enough that Eleanor thought she wasn't going to answer. Then she set the dough aside and wiped her hands on her apron. "She was stubborn," Marta said, "the kind of stubborn that looks like strength from a distance and feels like a wall when you're up close to it." She looked at Eleanor. "She had a good heart, a genuinely good heart, but she couldn't look at a wrong thing and walk away from it. It wasn't in her nature." "And Blackwell," Eleanor said. "She was investigating him specifically?" "She was investigating all of them. But Blackwell was the center of it." Marta picked up her coffee cup and turned it in her hands. "He was here for dinner once, before I understood what he was. He sat at that table and told stories about his time back east, about the law school he'd attended, about the principles of justice." She set the cup down. "He's an educated man. That's the worst part of it. He knows exactly what he's doing and why it's wrong, and he does it anyway." Eleanor thought about the clean patch on the wall of her room. "Did Clara keep anything in the house? Records, papers?" "Not where I knew about," Marta said. "She was careful. After she was gone, men came and looked through the house. They were polite about it. Gideon let them, because refusing would have looked like he had something to hide." She paused. "They didn't find anything." "Either because there was nothing to find," Eleanor said, "or because Clara hid it somewhere they didn't look." Marta looked at her steadily. "That would be my guess too," she said. On the 5th day, Eleanor went to town. She brought Thomas and Caleb with her. Thomas because he was reliable, and Caleb because he was the kind of boy who noticed things, and she wanted his eyes. And left Agnes in charge of the younger children with the authority that only a 12-year-old who has been given a clear mandate can bring to bear. Marta was there too, but Eleanor had learned that Marta's authority ran on different rails than the children's, and a transitional structure was necessary. The wagon ride into Blackstone Valley in daylight was different from arriving in it at dusk. She could see it properly now, the way the mountains framed it to the west, still heavy with snow at the peaks. The farmland coming in from the south, most of it dormant under the winter gray. The town itself sitting at the junction of 2 roads, a collection of maybe 30 buildings in various states of permanence, from the solid stone-fronted bank to the leaning, slightly left saloon that looked like it had been built in a hurry and regretted it. She noticed people noticing her, not all of them. Most of the town went about its business without looking up. But enough. A woman who watched from the doorway of the dress shop. 2 men outside the hardware who stopped their conversation as the wagon passed. A boy who ran alongside for a few steps before veering away. "They know whose wagon this is," Caleb said from beside her on the bench. He said it the way he said most things. "A statement Not a judgment, just the thing he'd observed. Yes, Eleanor said. They do. The post office was in the back half of a building that fronted as a general goods store, separated from the main floor by a half wall with a hinged counter and a line of letterboxes behind. The woman working the counter when Eleanor came through the door was somewhere in her late 30s, with the kind of face that had been handsome and was now something more interesting than handsome. Character laid down over the good bones like layers of finish on old wood. She had brown eyes that went very still when Eleanor walked in. "I'm Eleanor Hartwell," Eleanor said. She said it quietly because the store had 2 other customers and she had no way yet of knowing what those people knew or whose side they leaned toward, or whether sides were even the right way to think about it. "I believe you knew Clara Cross." The woman's expression didn't change exactly, but something moved through it like wind moves through grass, a ripple that passed and left everything in a slightly different position. "Annalise Brenner," she said. "I run the Post." She glanced at the 2 other customers, a man looking at nails in a bin, a woman examining bolts of cloth, and back at Eleanor. "I have packages to sort in the back. Could you give me a moment?" Eleanor nodded. Annalise came around the counter and led her through the half-wall door and into a narrow back room lined with cubbyholes and stacked crates. It smelled like paper and wax, and the particular dusty warmth of a room that doesn't get cold because it has too many things in it. She turned around and looked at Eleanor with those careful brown eyes. "He sent you to talk to me," she said. "Gideon told me you were Clara's friend," Eleanor said. "He didn't ask me to come. I decided to myself." Annalise studied her for a moment. "You got here 5 days ago. The whole town knows about it." "I imagine they do. Do you know what you're in the middle of?" "Gideon told me," Eleanor said, "about the land claims, about Blackwell, about Clara." Annalisa sat down on a crate slowly, the way a person sits when they suddenly need to put their weight somewhere. "He told you about Clara," she said. "He told me what she was doing, what she found." Eleanor paused. "He doesn't know where she hid the evidence. He thinks maybe you do." Annalisa was quiet for a long time, long enough that Eleanor could hear the murmur of the customers out front, and somewhere in the store, a clock ticking. "She didn't tell me where," Annalisa said finally. "She was careful about that. She said it was safer if I didn't know the location, but she told me." She stopped. Her jaw worked. "She told me what was in it, the full scope of it." Eleanor sat down on the edge of a crate across from her. "Tell me," Annalise told her. It took a long time, and it was worse than Eleanor had expected, which was saying something because she had expected it to be bad. 43 families. That was the number Annalisa said Clara had documented. 43 families who had lost land or property through Blackwell's court and the system of falsified records supporting it. Some of them had left the territory entirely, drifting west to try again somewhere else. Some had stayed and found work as hands on the very land that had been taken from them, which was its own particular cruelty. 3 that Clara had found had died. Not killed exactly, or not obviously, but died in the way that people die when they've lost everything and have nothing left to sustain them through a hard winter. The money, across all of it, ran into figures that Eleanor couldn't hold in her head easily. Land in the valley had become increasingly valuable as the railroad pushed westward, which was a fact Blackwell had apparently understood earlier than most. The investors back east were a small group, 5 men. Clara had identified 4 of them by name, who had been quietly purchasing the territory's best land for a fraction of its actual value through a network of shell transactions that ran through 3 different territories and required considerable legal expertise to trace, which was where Blackwell's particular usefulness came in. "He doesn't just make the court decisions," Annalisa said. "He designs the whole mechanism. He knows what paperwork to alter and what to leave alone. He knows which records to lose and which to keep. He knows how federal land oversight works and where the gaps are." She looked at her hands. "Clara said he was the most dangerous kind of corrupt man. Not because he's ruthless, though he is, but because he's meticulous. He doesn't make mistakes." Clara found proof despite that. Clara was more meticulous than he was. Annalise's voice had something in it that was grief worn smooth by time. "She was the only person I've ever known who could out-detail him, and he knew it. Toward the end, she told me she thought she was being watched, that things were moving faster than she'd planned. She didn't stop, Eleanor said. No. A pause. I told her to. I said whatever she was building, it wasn't worth... She stopped. She said that the families who'd lost their land couldn't stop. They didn't get to decide it wasn't worth it. So she didn't either. Eleanor sat with that for a moment. The proof she gathered, she said. She hid it somewhere it survived. Whatever happened after, the men going through the house, they didn't find it, which means it's still somewhere. That's what I believe, Annalisa said. She was too careful for it to just be gone. Do you have any idea where she would have chosen? What kind of place? Annalise thought. She used to say that the safest place to hide something was somewhere the people looking for it wouldn't look. Not because it was inaccessible, but because it wouldn't occur to them. She looked up. She said Blackwell and his kind thought like powerful men. They'd look in places where a woman with resources would hide things. Strong boxes, lawyers' offices, banks. They wouldn't think about ordinary places. Eleanor turned that over. Ordinary places, she said. That's all she said about it. They sat for a moment in the close warmth of the back room with all its paper and dust. I need to ask you something, Annalisa said, and I need you to be honest with me. All right. Why are you doing this? She wasn't unfriendly. She was just direct, the kind of direct that comes from having had too many things sugar-coated and then gone bad underneath. You came here for shelter, for a safe place to keep your children. You don't owe Clara anything. You don't owe this valley anything. Why are you putting yourself in the middle of this? Eleanor thought about how to answer that. She could have said the easy version, that it was the right thing to do, that justice mattered, the kind of thing that sounds true because it is true, and also because it costs nothing to say. But Annalise was looking at her like a woman who had heard easy versions before. Because my children live here now, Eleanor said, and this place isn't safe until Blackwell is gone. And I can either wait and hope he leaves us alone, or I can help make sure he doesn't have the chance to hurt anyone else the way he hurt Clara. She paused. I'm also not a woman who does well with waiting. Annalise looked at her for a long moment. Then something in her face shifted. Not quite a smile, but something adjacent to one. The look of a person who has been holding a weight alone for a long time and has just found someone willing to take an end of it. I have things, Annalisa said. Not the core evidence. I don't have that. But notes Clara sent me over 2 years. Letters. Things she wrote down that she thought I should know in case... She stopped. In case she couldn't finish it herself. Can I see them? Not here. Annalisa stood. Come back Thursday. Come alone. Come to the back door. Eleanor nodded. She said goodbye to Annalise and went back through the store and found Thomas and Caleb waiting outside with the patient tolerance of boys who have been made to wait for things they don't fully understand. She said nothing on the ride home except to ask Caleb what he'd seen in town while she was inside. He told her. He'd been watching, as she'd expected. He had a good eye and a good memory, and he gave her a quiet accounting of who'd been out, who'd gone in and out of the courthouse at the end of the main street, whether any of the men she'd described to him from Gideon's account had been visible. One of them had. A man named Hollis, who worked in some vague capacity for the land office, and whose name Gideon had mentioned as one of the people Blackwell used to handle the administrative side of the scheme. He'd come out of the courthouse with another man Caleb didn't recognize, talked for a few minutes, and then both had gone separate ways. Was he looking at you? Eleanor asked. He looked at the wagon, Caleb said. Then at me. Then away. He paused. He looked away too fast. Eleanor filed that. When they got back to the ranch, Gideon was in the yard talking to Cord about something that involved the fence line on the north pasture. He broke off when the wagon came in and looked at Eleanor. She gave him the smallest nod, the kind that means later, and he understood it. They talked after supper, after the children were in bed. Eleanor sat at the kitchen table and laid out what Annalise had told her. The 43 families, the investors, the mechanism, Blackwell's particular role in designing the whole apparatus. Gideon listened without interrupting. He was good at that. He had the stillness of a man who had learned that talking over someone was how you missed the parts that mattered. When she finished, he said, she had more than I knew. Clara went deeper than she told you, Eleanor said. She was protecting me. He said it without bitterness, which Eleanor thought was hard-won. Bitterness would have been the easier response. Maybe. Or maybe she was afraid that if you knew the full scope of it, you'd try to stop her. He thought about that. Yes, he said. I would have. Thursday I'm going back to see Annalise. She has letters, notes, things Clara sent her. Eleanor wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. If we can piece together enough of what Clara knew, reconstruct the evidence, or find enough to know where she hid the rest of it, we might have something we can take to federal authorities, bypassing Blackwell's court entirely. Blackwell has friends in the federal circuit, Gideon said. He may have, but the federal circuit is larger than this territory, and 43 families is a number that's hard to ignore if it's in front of the right people. She met his eyes. Clara built this case methodically. Even without the original documents, if Annalise's materials are detailed enough, we may be able to make the case through secondary evidence. Gideon was quiet. He turned his coffee cup on the table, a slow rotation, once. Hollis saw Caleb today, Eleanor said. Recognized the wagon. Cord told me. He has sources in town. He stopped rotating the cup. They'll report it to Blackwell, that you went to town. I was running errands, getting post. That's what I'll say if anyone asks. It won't be enough to raise suspicion by itself, Gideon said. But if you go back to see Annalise, Thursday, I'll be careful. Eleanor. He said her name in a particular way. Not sharp, not soft. Direct. Like a hand placed on a surface to stop something from sliding. These men are not. I know what they are, she said. I know what they did to Clara. Then you know what they're capable of. Yes. She looked at him steadily. Which is why I intend to move faster than they're expecting. He looked at her for a long moment. You're going to do this regardless of what I say, he said. Not a question, and not quite resignation either. I'm going to do this, Eleanor said, because it needs doing. And because my children are here, and I need this place to be safe for them. Those two things are equally true, and I'm not separating them. Another silence. The fire settled in the hearth. All right, he said. Then I'll tell you what I know about Hollis and the two other men at the land office. Things I noticed over the past 2 years that I didn't have anyone to tell. She got up and brought the coffee pot back to the table. Sat down again. Start at the beginning, she said. The following days moved in the particular way of days when you are waiting for something and cannot hurry it. Eleanor ran the household and helped Marta and got her children settled into something resembling a routine, which was harder than it sounded because 9 children have 9 separate opinions about what a routine should look like, and reconciling them required the kind of diplomacy that made frontier politics seem simple. Rosie recovered fully and became the shadow of Owen, the barn boy, who bore this with a patience that Eleanor suspected came from being an only child and finding the novelty of being followed around by a 6-year-old with questions somewhat charming. Hannah attached herself to Marta in the kitchen with an intensity that the older woman seemed to find either endearing or exhausting depending on the hour. James found a litter of barn cats and appointed himself their official caretaker, a position the cats appeared to be largely unaware of. Thomas and Caleb were different. They were older, and older meant they understood more, and understanding more meant they couldn't entirely settle. She could see it in the way Thomas watched Gideon, studying the man the way you study someone you're trying to decide whether to trust. And she could see it in Caleb, who was quieter than Thomas and more interior, who had taken to going for long walks around the ranch perimeter in the mornings, ostensibly to look at things, but Eleanor suspected primarily to think. On the second day, Caleb came to her in the afternoon while the others were occupied and said, "The foreman, Cord. He watches the road." Eleanor looked up from the mending she was doing. "What do you mean?" "Every morning and most afternoons," Caleb said. "He finds a reason to be somewhere with a line of sight to the main road. He's watching for something, or someone." She thought about this. "Does Gideon know?" "I think Gideon asked him to." She nodded slowly. Gideon watching the road through Cord, not wanting to be seen to be watching himself. Careful, in the way that 2 years of being watched back had made him careful. "Keep noticing things," she told Caleb. "Write them down if you want to remember them." He looked at her. That particular look he'd had since he was small, the one that meant he was deciding whether to say the thing he was thinking. "Are we safe here?" he asked. She owed him honesty. He was 15, and he was smart, and she had never found any value in lying to smart children about the things that mattered. "Not completely," she said. "Not yet, but we're working on it." He nodded once, the same way Gideon nodded. That gesture of acknowledged information, of filing it somewhere useful. She wondered when he'd picked that up, then realized it had probably always been there. On Wednesday night, the temperature dropped sharply, and by Thursday morning there was new snow on the ground. Not deep, just a few inches, but enough to make the road into town uncertain. Eleanor decided to go anyway, and Gideon didn't try to talk her out of it, which she took as a sign that he was learning how she worked. She went alone, as Annalise had said. The horse she took was one of Gideon's work horses, sturdy and sensible, and she pushed it to a pace just fast enough to get her there before the light went flat. The back door of the building that held the post office opened onto a narrow alley between it and the feed merchant next door. Annalise was waiting for her, standing in the doorframe with a look on her face that was not quite worry, but not worry either. "Come in fast," she said. Eleanor came in fast. The door closed behind her. The back room was dimmer than before, most of the light cut off by the overcast sky outside the small window. Annalisa went to one of the stacked crates in the corner and moved 3 of them aside with the practiced efficiency of someone who had moved them before, many times, and would need to move them back quickly. Behind them was a flat board against the wall that she slid aside to reveal a shallow space in the wall itself. Not a built-in cavity, more like a gap between the original plank wall and a secondary layer that had been added later, maybe a foot deep, maybe 18 inches high. She reached in and brought out a bundle wrapped in oilcloth and tied with twine. Eleanor's hands were steady as she took it. Inside the oilcloth was a stack of folded papers, some of them letters in a small, precise hand, some of them what looked like lists, and 3 of them larger sheets covered in what appeared to be a kind of organizational diagram. Lines connecting names and dates and numbers. "She sent me these in batches," Annalisa said, "over about a year and a half. I don't think she sent me everything. This is the portion she thought I could hold safely, but it's detailed." Eleanor looked at the top letter. The handwriting was careful and compact, the kind of writing that comes from someone who thinks before they put pen to paper. "Annie, I am sending you the 3rd set. I want you to understand what you are holding so that if something happens, you will know how to use it. The names on the large sheets are arranged by function, not by importance. Blackwell is at the center, but he is not the beginning. The investors came first. I have their names, but not yet the documentation that ties them directly to the land transfers. That documentation exists, and I know where to find it. I have not yet retrieved it because I am not yet ready to move, and I need to be ready before I do. When the time comes, I will tell you where to go. Until then, hold these where no one would think to look for a woman's private correspondence." Eleanor read it twice. The documentation exists, and I know where to find it, which meant the core evidence wasn't hidden on the ranch or in town. It was somewhere else. A 3rd location that Clara had identified but not reached, or had reached and hidden without ever telling Annalisa. She looked up at Annalise. "Did she ever tell you? When the time came?" Annalisa's face answered before she spoke. "No," she said quietly. "She died before she was ready." Eleanor folded the letter carefully and set it on top of the others. "I need to take these," she said. Annalise nodded. She had already known this would happen. "Be careful with them," she said. "They're all I have left of her in some ways." Eleanor wrapped the bundle back in its oilcloth and put it inside her coat, against her body where it wouldn't shift. She thought of 43 families. She thought of the clean patch on the wall in her room. She thought of Gideon at the kitchen table turning his coffee cup around and around. She thought of her 9 children upstairs in beds, finally warm, finally still, in a place they were just beginning to believe might actually hold them. "I'll be careful," she said. She came out of the alley and turned the horse toward home and rode through the thin winter light with Clara's letters pressed against her chest, her mind already turning over what it meant, what it changed, what it didn't, and what the next move had to be. She was almost clear of town when she saw Hollis. He was coming out of the land office, and he stopped when he saw her. Just for a moment, a pause, a blink, the smallest recalibration. Then he tipped his hat, the way men do, and went the other way. Eleanor kept her expression easy. She nodded back and rode on. But her heart was going harder than the horse's pace warranted, and she didn't let herself look back because looking back was how you told someone they'd rattled you, and she was not about to give him that. She rode home through the cold and the thin snow, And when the ranch came into sight at the end of the drive, she let out a breath she'd been holding for 4 miles. Gideon was in the yard. He looked at her face when she came through the gate, and something shifted in his. "Inside," she said, "I need to show you something." She dismounted and handed the horse to Owen without breaking stride, and Gideon followed her in. She put Clara's letters on the kitchen table between them, and for the next 2 hours they read through everything together, Gideon's face going through a series of things she chose not to watch too closely. It was private, what showed in a man's face when he read his dead wife's handwriting. She gave it to him by looking at the papers instead. When they finished, the kitchen was quiet for a long time. "She was closer than I knew," Gideon said finally. His voice was rough. "Yes," Eleanor said. "The documentation she mentioned, where the investors tied to the transfers, she'd found it somewhere. She just hadn't retrieved it yet. Or she retrieved it and hid it and didn't write that part down." Eleanor looked at the diagram Clara had made, the lines connecting names and figures and dates. Either way, it exists. She was sure of it. Gideon put his hand flat on the table, palm down, and was quiet. "She was so damn careful," he said. It wasn't quite anger. It wasn't quite grief. It was the specific feeling of admiring someone and wanting them back at the same time. Eleanor didn't say anything to that because there was nothing useful to say. She just waited until the moment passed. "We need to find it," she said then. "The core evidence, before Blackwell understands what we're doing." "He may already suspect," Gideon said. "He suspects something. He doesn't know what." She looked at the papers. "Hollis saw me leaving town today. He'll report it, but he can't know what I was doing. He'll want to find out. Let him try." She said it more evenly than she entirely felt. "We have these now, and we know more than we did a week ago." She began carefully folding the papers back into the oilcloth. Clara found the documentation, and she didn't leave it with Annalise, which means she hid it somewhere she thought was safe. Somewhere ordinary, she told Annalise, somewhere powerful men wouldn't look. Gideon's eyes moved around the kitchen, around the room they were sitting in. Eleanor looked at him. They were both thinking the same thing, she realized, both looking at the same walls, the same ordinary, unremarkable ranch house that 2 years ago had been the home of a meticulous woman with a mind for hiding things in plain sight. They had been sitting in it for a week. She hadn't finished looking yet. They searched the house that night. Not frantically. Eleanor didn't do frantic, and Gideon seemed constitutionally opposed to it, but methodically, the way you search when you're looking for something hidden by someone who was smarter than the people who came looking after her. They started in the kitchen because Marta had gone to her room and the children were in bed, and it was the one place they could move through without explanation. Gideon took the pantry and the cold storage. Eleanor went over the kitchen walls inch by inch, running her hands along the plank seams, pressing at spots where the wood had maybe been disturbed and re-nailed. She checked the underside of shelves. She pulled out the flour bin and the meal sacks and looked at the floor beneath them. Nothing. They moved to the front room. The big hearth had a stone surround that Gideon knew well enough to say with confidence nothing had been worked into it. He'd repointed the mortar himself the previous spring and would have found anything hidden there. Eleanor checked the window frames, the baseboards, the space under the stairs. Still nothing. By the time they got to the back of the house, to the narrow hallway that connected the kitchen to the back bedroom, Eleanor's room, it was past 10 o'clock, and the fire in the front room had burned down to low orange coals. Eleanor stood in the hallway and looked at the door to her room. "The clean patch on the wall," she said. Gideon looked at her. "What patch?" "Inside, near the window. The wall is cleaner there than anywhere else, like something was taken down and the mark scrubbed away." She pushed the door open and they went in. He saw it immediately once she pointed it out. He'd just never had reason to look before, or maybe had been avoiding looking too closely at this room in particular. He put his hand against the clean area and then moved along the wall to either side. "The board's here," he said. He pressed at one and it didn't give. Pressed at the next one and it shifted. Just slightly. Just enough. They looked at each other. He got a knife from the kitchen and worked the edge of it along the board's seam. It wasn't nailed. It was seated in a groove, fitted in from the side, designed to look like wall planking, but removable if you knew it was there. He worked it out carefully and set it aside. Behind it was a space maybe 6 inches deep and 2 feet wide, running between the interior wall and the exterior log. In it was a tin dispatch box, the kind you could buy at any general store for keeping papers, with a simple latch that had been wound around with a piece of wire. Eleanor's hands were steady as she lifted it out. It was heavier than she expected. Gideon stood very still. She unwound the wire, opened the latch, lifted the lid. Papers. A great many papers, organized with the same careful precision as everything else Clara had apparently done in her life. Survey maps with notations in red ink, land office records, originals, not copies, the kind that should have been filed somewhere official but had instead been quietly removed or substituted. Letters between men whose names she'd seen on Annalise's diagrams. A ledger, small and dense, with figures and dates and initials. And at the top, a single folded sheet, separate from the rest. Eleanor unfolded it. If you're reading this, it means I was not able to finish what I started. I am sorry for that. I want you to know that I understood what I was doing and I did not do it carelessly. The evidence in this box is sufficient to bring a federal case against Victor Blackwell and the 4 men named on the first ledger page. The land records are originals removed from the territorial office. I will leave it to others to judge how I obtained them. The letters are real. The figures in the ledger are documented against their corresponding deed transfers, which are also included. To whoever finds this, these families deserve their land back. That is all this ever was about. CHC. Clara Harriet Cross. Eleanor looked at the initials for a moment. Then she folded the letter carefully and placed it back inside the box. Gideon had not moved. She finished it, Eleanor said quietly. She just didn't get to use it. He sat down on the edge of the bed, and Eleanor let him sit there. Let the silence be what it needed to be. She put the lid on the box and set it on the washstand and went to the window and looked out at the dark yard and the darker tree line beyond it, and thought about a woman she'd never met who had done a thing she understood completely, had kept going even when she'd known the risk, had built something careful and complete, and then hidden it where she hoped it would be found by the right people at the right time. After a while, Gideon said, "We need to get that to federal authorities." "Yes," Eleanor said. "We need to figure out how, quickly, and without Blackwell knowing what we have until it's too late for him to do anything about it." She turned from the window. He was looking at her with an expression she was getting better at reading. Not quite trust, not quite not trust, but the particular look of a man reassessing what he thought he knew about his own situation. "I know someone," he said, "a federal marshal. He came through the territory about 3 years ago, before Clara died. He and I spent a few days riding the North Line together. There'd been some trouble with cattle theft, and he was investigating it. We got along. He's based in Denver. Can you reach him directly, without it going through the local circuit? If I write to the federal marshal office in Denver directly, and I mark it to his attention, yes, Blackwell doesn't have reach that far. How long would it take? Letter takes 2 weeks to get there. Response takes 2 weeks back, even if he moves immediately. That's a month, Eleanor said. At least. She looked at the tin box on the washstand. We can't send the originals through the mail. If the letter was intercepted. No, he agreed. We'd need to deliver them in person, or have someone deliver them. They were quiet for a moment, both working it out. Write the letter, Eleanor said. Send it tomorrow, first thing, before anyone in town has reason to wonder what you're doing. Tell him what we have and that you need him here. In the meantime, we keep the box hidden and we act like nothing has changed. And if Blackwell moves before the marshal arrives? Eleanor didn't answer immediately. That was the part she hadn't worked out yet, and she wasn't going to pretend she had. We'll cross that when we reach it, she said. Go write the letter. The next 2 weeks were a particular kind of hard. The hard of knowing something dangerous and not being able to act on it directly, of going about ordinary life with something extraordinary locked away in a tin box. Gideon sent the letter. Cord reported that Hollis had been seen watching the ranch road twice in 1 week, always from a distance, never approaching. Eleanor told the children nothing specific but watched them more closely, calculating without meaning to, which of them could run fast, which were sensible under pressure, which would freeze. Thomas, she thought, would hold. Agnes, too, in her determinedly capable way. Caleb she was less certain about, not because he was weak, but because he was the kind of person who thought so hard about what the right thing to do was that he sometimes locked up in the middle of doing it. She'd seen it happen twice since they'd arrived. He'd be fine once he started moving. The trick was getting him moving. She and Gideon had settled into something over those weeks that she didn't have a name for yet. Not the arrangement they'd agreed to in the letter, that formal contract of need meeting need, but something that was being built out of the daily practice of being in the same house, making the same decisions, watching each other handle things. He was not Robert. Robert had been warmth and talk and generosity with himself in a way that Gideon simply wasn't. But there was something in Gideon that she'd come to recognize as its own kind of reliability. A consistency of character that didn't depend on mood or circumstance, that was just there the same way the walls were there. She'd stopped noticing the walls, which meant she'd stopped worrying about whether they'd hold. They hadn't had another long late-night conversation like the first two. They didn't need to. They'd found a shorter language, the kind where a look across the table covered what would have taken 5 sentences a month ago. She wasn't sure when that had happened. On a Thursday afternoon, 3 weeks after Gideon's letter had gone out, Cord came in from the road at a controlled trot that was faster than his usual pace. Eleanor saw him from the kitchen window and was on the porch before he'd finished dismounting. "Ryder came from town," Cord said. He was breathing a little harder than riding at that pace should have required, which meant he'd been tense before he started. Went to Blackwell's office first, then came out to the road. He was asking someone directions. Directions to where? Cord looked at her steadily. "Out here." Eleanor went inside and found Gideon. They had 20 minutes, maybe 30, before whoever it was arrived. Eleanor went to her room and moved the tin box. She'd moved it twice since the first night, once to under the floorboard beneath the bed, once to a less obvious spot she'd found in the barn, in the false bottom of an old feed box. Now she took it from there and thought fast. She ended up putting it in the most ordinary place she could think of, in the bottom of the trunk in her room, underneath a layer of children's winter clothes waiting to be mended. Not clever exactly, but ordinary, Clara's logic. She was back in the kitchen when the writer arrived. He was a young man, mid-20s maybe, with the official look of someone who'd been sent to do something he'd been told was routine. He introduced himself as a deputy from the county seat, which was 3 territories over and had a different sheriff than Blackwell's pocket. He said there was a legal matter concerning the deed to Cross Ranch, and that Judge Blackwell's court had issued a notice requiring Gideon's appearance at 9 o'clock the following morning. He handed Gideon an official-looking document. Gideon read it. His face did not change. "What legal matter?" Eleanor asked, before Gideon could respond. The deputy glanced at her. "Ma'am?" "What is the legal matter?" she said. "That requires my husband's presence in court tomorrow morning." She let the word husband land deliberately, even though the ceremony hadn't happened yet. She wanted it on record, in this young man's memory, that she considered herself part of this household. "A complaint has been filed," the deputy said, "regarding a land boundary dispute. The notice just requires Mr. Cross's appearance to give testimony." "A land boundary dispute," Eleanor repeated. "With whom?" "I'm not able to say, ma'am. I just deliver the notices." After he left, Gideon set the paper on the table and looked at it. "It's not a boundary dispute," Eleanor said. "No," he agreed. "It never is." "What will it be?" He was quiet. "If Blackwell is ready to move openly, it will be an accusation, something he can use to have me held, removed from the ranch." He picked up the paper and folded it carefully. "Or it could be a warning, a way of saying we know you're doing something and this is your chance to stop." "Which do you think it is?" He thought about it honestly. "I don't know. I don't know what they've seen or what they suspect." He set the paper down again. "If they figured out that you went to see Annalise, they can't know what Annalise gave me." "No, but if they suspect it." The kitchen door opened and Caleb came in, smelling of cold air and hay from wherever he'd been, and stopped when he read the room. "What happened?" he said. Eleanor looked at him. 15 years old, sharp eyes, steady hands, the particular combination of qualities that she'd been taking for granted. Because he was her son, and she'd watched them develop gradually and hadn't stepped back recently to see what they'd added up to. She picked up the notice and handed it to him. "Read that." He read it. Then he read it again, which was how he processed things. Once fast, once slow, the second time for what was underneath the first. "This isn't about a fence line," he said. "No," Eleanor said. "So what is it?" Gideon looked at Eleanor. Eleanor looked at Caleb. "Sit down," she said. There's something I need to tell you. She told him everything. Not summarized, not softened. The full account, from Clara's investigation to the tin box to the letter Gideon had sent to Denver. Caleb sat across the table and listened with the same quality of stillness she'd seen in Gideon, which had apparently been in her son all along, and she just needed the right circumstances to see it clearly. When she finished, he said, "The marshal. Have you heard back?" "Not yet." "It's been 3 weeks." "I know." He turned the notice over in his hands. "If they take Gideon tomorrow, if this is an arrest, not a hearing, you lose the ranch. They can say it's administrative hold or contested ownership or anything they want, and the evidence is here." "Yes," Eleanor said, "and the children are here." "Yes." He set the paper down. He looked at Gideon. "How far is Denver?" Gideon was very still. 4 days hard ride, maybe 3.5 if the weather held. But the mountain pass. What about the mountain pass? Gideon glanced at the window. The sky had gone the particular color it went when a front was building in from the northwest. The color Eleanor had been watching with increasing attention for 2 days. "There's a storm coming," Gideon said quietly. "Could close the high pass for a week if it's a bad one." Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "If someone left tonight and rode fast, they could be through the pass before the storm hit. Maybe." "Caleb," Eleanor said. "I'm not saying I should go," he said. "I'm saying it's the option. You're 15. "I know the mountains," he said. "Owen taught me the North Trail last week, and I can ride well enough." He met her eyes, not defiantly. He was past the age of defiance and into something more measured. "Mama, if Gideon goes to that courthouse tomorrow and doesn't come back, what do you do?" Eleanor sat with that. It was the question she'd been turning over since the deputy left. The one she hadn't said aloud yet because saying it aloud meant choosing. "There's another option," Gideon said. "I go tomorrow. I hear what Blackwell has to say. If it's truly a boundary dispute, a pressure move, I cooperate and come home and we wait for the marshal." "And if it's not?" Caleb said. Gideon didn't answer. "Then he's in a cell," Caleb said. "And Blackwell's men come here for the evidence. And we have nothing to defend ourselves with because the one man with legal authority in this territory is the man trying to take everything." The kitchen was very quiet. Eleanor stood up from the table. She walked to the window and looked out at the sky. That gray-green color, the clouds building on the northwest ridge like something patient and enormous gathering itself. She turned around. "Gideon goes tomorrow," she said. "He cooperates, doesn't give Blackwell any reason to escalate." She looked at Caleb. "And tonight, you ride for Denver." Caleb's face went very still. Not scared. He was scared. She could see that. She could always see that in him no matter how still he went. But past scared into the place where fear becomes a thing you factor in rather than a thing that decides. "Tonight," he said. "If the storm hits the pass tomorrow morning, you need to be through it tonight." She sat back down. "You'll take the box. Wrapped in oilcloth, in your saddlebag. You'll take Owen with you as far as the mountain road. He knows the trail better than you do. And then Owen comes back and you ride alone." "Why not Cord?" Caleb asked. He wasn't arguing against going, he was thinking. "Because Cord needs to be here," Gideon said. He was watching Eleanor with an expression she didn't stop to interpret. "And because Cord is known, a middle-aged ranch hand riding hard for Denver the night before a court hearing would be noticed. A boy riding out. People see what they expect to see. A boy on an errand, running messages." Caleb looked down at his hands. Then he looked up. "What do I say when I get there?" he said. "To the marshal." Eleanor got up and went to the front room and came back with paper and a pen. She sat down at the table. "I'm going to write a letter," she said. "To Marshal." She looked at Gideon. "Aldrich Raines," Gideon said. "To Marshal Raines. You'll give it to him directly. You'll tell him who you are and who sent you and what you're carrying, and you won't give any of it to anyone else. Not a deputy, not a secretary, not anyone who says they'll pass it along. Raines directly. Can you do that?" "Yes," Caleb said. He said it the way he said things when he meant them. Flat, no ornamentation. "You eat first," Eleanor said, "and you sleep 2 hours. I'll wake you at midnight." "Mama, 2 hours. You'll be riding through the night. You need to rest first." She was already writing. And you do not take unnecessary risks on the mountain. You understand me? If the trail is impassable, you turn back. We'll find another way. And if the trail is passable but hard, Caleb asked. She kept writing. Then you ride hard. The 2 hours felt like 10 minutes. Eleanor woke Caleb at midnight as promised and watched him eat cold biscuits and cheese at the kitchen table while Gideon packed the saddlebag with the tin box wrapped in 3 layers of oilcloth and tied with enough cord to survive a river crossing. Marta appeared from her room without anyone having to wake her. She had some instinct for when she was needed and handed Caleb a folded cloth packet of food without a word. Owen was waiting at the barn, already saddling the horses, his face carefully neutral in the way of someone who has decided not to let himself feel the full weight of the thing he's doing. Eleanor stood with Caleb at the barn door while Gideon gave Owen last instructions about the route. She put her hands on Caleb's face. He was almost as tall as her now, which still surprised her sometimes, and looked at him. You remember the letter, she said. It's in my coat. Rains directly. I know. Don't stop in any town along the mountain road. Keep moving until you're through the pass. Mama. He said her name gently, the way you say a word to someone who's repeating themselves. I know. She let go of his face. I know you know, she said. He hugged her. Quick, hard, the way he always did, like he didn't trust himself to do it slowly, and then pulled back and picked up his saddlebag. I'll be fast, he said. Be careful, she said. Fast doesn't matter if careful goes first. He mounted up, and Owen mounted, and the two of them went out through the barn door into the cold black night, and Eleanor stood there listening to the hoofbeats until they faded into nothing and the yard was quiet except for the wind picking up in the tree line. Gideon came to stand beside her. She was not going to fall apart. She was not going to do that. She breathed in the cold air and held it and let it out. He's a good rider, Gideon said. I know he is. And Owen knows that trail well. I know. He was quiet. She was quiet. The wind moved through the pines at the edge of the yard with a sound like rushing water. You should sleep, he said. So should you. Neither of them moved for a moment. Eleanor, he said. He stopped. Tried again. If tomorrow goes badly, if Blackwell is moving to arrest me, I need you to not fight it. I need you to let it happen and keep the children inside and wait. I understand. I mean it. Whatever Blackwell does to me, they can't make a case stick once the marshal has the evidence. The worst he can do is hold me for a few days. But if you give him a reason to move against you, I understand, she said again. And she meant it. And she also knew that understanding something and being able to do it were not always the same animal. But she would do it. She had 9 children in this house, and one riding through the mountains in the dark, and she could not afford anything except the most strategic version of herself until this was over. She went inside. She lay down on her bed in her clothes and listened to the wind build outside and tried not to think about mountain passes. Gideon left for town at 8 o'clock in the morning. The sky had gone the color of iron by then, the clouds packed in low and heavy over the peaks, and the temperature had dropped another 10 degrees overnight. He'd put on his good coat and his decent hat, the ones he wore when he needed to look like a man with standing rather than a man with worries. And Eleanor had stood on the porch and watched him ride out the same way she'd watched Caleb ride out, still with her hands at her sides, calculating. Cord came up beside her. I'll have 2 of the men on the road, he said, close enough to see, but not close enough to be noticed. He paused. If things go wrong, they'll ride back. How will they know? They'll know, he said, with the certainty of a man who has read situations for a long time. Eleanor nodded. She went inside. The morning was the longest of her life, or at least it competed hard with the morning Robert died and the morning after, and the particular morning 2 weeks into the journey west when she'd woken up and for the first time genuinely didn't know if they were going to make it. She kept the younger children occupied, set them tasks, kept them moving, kept the noise and the ordinary chaos of a large family going, because the ordinary chaos was a thing she could manage and management was what she had instead of control. Thomas knew something was happening. He was 14 and observant, and he'd been watching the road since breakfast. Eleanor told him that Gideon had a legal matter in town and would likely be back by afternoon, and she said it in a tone that asked him to be the person she needed him to be today. And he was. He took charge of the younger ones without being asked and didn't press her for details she hadn't offered. Agnes kept the kitchen running with Marta. She was 12 and took the responsibility with the seriousness that 12-year-olds bring to things that feel important, which meant she also narrated everything she was doing at considerable volume. But Eleanor decided that was fine. Noise was fine. Noise meant everyone was here. She was putting Hannah down for an afternoon rest. The 4-year-old had picked up on the ambient tension in the way small children do and was clingy and fractious when she heard hoofbeats in the yard. Fast hoofbeats. She came downstairs to find Cord already at the door. One of the ranch hands, Pete, the young one, barely older than Thomas, had ridden back hard. He was breathing fast, his horse sweating despite the cold. They arrested him, Pete said. Judge Blackwell came out of the courthouse himself, and there were 4 men with him, and they took him off his horse right there on the main street. He looked at Eleanor. They said he killed a man, a drifter who turned up dead near the south pasture last week. They said Gideon did it. The room was very quiet. He didn't kill anyone, Thomas said, from behind Eleanor. His voice was tight. I know that, Pete said. He looked at Eleanor. What do you want us to do? Eleanor stood very still for a moment. Everything she'd prepared for, everything she'd told herself she'd do if this happened. It was all lined up and available. She just had to choose it. Let it happen. Whatever Blackwell does to me, they can't make a case stick once the marshal has the evidence. Nothing, she said. Not yet. Mama, Thomas said. Not yet, she said again. She turned to look at him. He had his jaw set the way Robert's had set when he was about to do something stubborn, and for one sharp moment she felt the particular loneliness of parenting a child who has inherited your own worst impulses. Listen to me, Thomas. Gideon knew this might happen. He told me what to do. She held his eyes. We wait. For what? For help to arrive. What help? From where? His voice cracked slightly on the last word. He was 14. He was trying very hard. Caleb, she said. Thomas went still. Eleanor looked at Cord. How many men does Blackwell have with him? 4 he brought from the courthouse, plus the men who worked the land office, Hollis and 2 others. Cord's face was professionally calm. And however many he's able to pull from town. Is he coming here? Not tonight. Tonight he'll want to secure Gideon. Make it look proper before he does anything else. Cord paused. Tomorrow he'll have questions. About what? About whether you know anything. He looked at her steadily. About what Clara Cross might have left behind. Eleanor thought about the tin box. Gone. In Caleb's saddlebag somewhere between here and Denver, God willing, she stopped, recalibrated. Somewhere in the mountains in the dark, through snow that was already starting to spit outside the window. Let him come and ask, she said. I don't know anything about what Clara Cross left behind. Cord held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded. There was something in his face she hadn't seen before. Not quite approval, because he wasn't the approving type, but something in the neighborhood of respect. She sent Pete back to watch the road. She told Cord to keep the hands close to the property. She went to the kitchen and helped Marta put dinner together and told the children that Gideon had been delayed in town on a legal matter and would likely be back in a day or 2. Is he in trouble? James asked. He's fine, Eleanor said. Eat your supper. She sat at the head of the table, Gideon's end, and ate without tasting anything, counting in her head. Caleb had left 12 hours ago. If Owen had gotten him to the mountain road, if the storm hadn't already closed the pass, if the boy had been riding hard, he might be through it by now. He might be on the other side, the Denver side, with the tin box and the letter and 43 families' worth of stolen futures in his saddlebag. Or he might be somewhere in the mountains, in a blizzard. She didn't say that. She put her fork down and looked at her children eating, all 8 of them, around this stranger's table, in this stranger's house, which was beginning to feel, just barely, like it might be becoming something else. And she thought, I will not lose this. I will not lose what we have built here, and I will not lose that boy in the mountains. And I will not let Blackwell have this ranch, and these children, and the lives that Clara Cross died trying to protect. She thought that, and she kept eating. Outside, the storm hit. It came in fast, the way mountain storms come in, without much warning after the long warning of the building clouds. Just suddenly the wind was a different animal, and the snow was horizontal, and the temperature dropped another 15 degrees in under an hour. Eleanor stood at the kitchen window and watched the yard disappear into white, and thought about a 15-year-old boy on a mountain trail in the dark. Thomas came to stand beside her. He'd figured out enough to know what she was thinking. "He'll make it," Thomas said. She put her arm around his shoulders. He was nearly as tall as her now, too, which she kept noticing. They were all getting tall. "Yes," she said. She didn't know if she believed it entirely, but she said it because that was what you did. The storm pressed against the windows, and the fire held in the hearth, and somewhere out there in all that white and cold, one of her children was writing. They came the next morning. Eleanor heard the horses before she saw them. 5 of them, coming up the ranch drive at a pace that wasn't a hurry, but wasn't casual either. Blackwell's 4 men, plus Hollis, who was apparently the one being given official authority for this particular errand. She watched them from the kitchen window, then went to the front room and told Thomas to take the younger children upstairs and keep them there. "What about me?" Agnes said. "You too." "I'm 12, Agnes." She went. Eleanor smoothed her skirt and opened the front door before anyone knocked. Hollis was in front, a lean, forgettable-looking man in his 40s who had the eyes of someone who'd learned to look at things without seeming to look at them. He had a paper in his hand. "Mrs. Hartwell," he said. "Mr. Hollis," she said. She kept her voice easy, her hands still. "You've ridden a long way in bad weather. Can I offer you coffee?" He blinked. She had the sense she'd said something that didn't fit what he'd prepared for. "Good. Ma'am, I have a court order to search this property in connection with the ongoing legal matter involving Mr. Cross." "What legal matter?" She let the words be precise. "The accusation is murder, Mr. Hollis, which I understand to be a serious charge. I also understand that under territorial law, a search of private property in connection with a murder investigation requires a specific accounting of what is being searched for. Does your order specify that?" He looked at the paper in his hand. She had not, in fact, studied territorial law on this point. She was gambling on the likelihood that a man running an administrative errand for a corrupt judge had not expected the person he was delivering it to ask careful questions. Yes, ma'am. It authorizes a search of the premises for evidence related to the case." "Evidence of what specifically?" "Of evidence of the crime." "The crime of murder," she said, "of a man whose name I understand to be unknown as yet. What evidence of a murder would you expect to find in a ranch house, Mr. Hollis?" A longer pause. One of the men behind him shifted in his saddle. "Ma'am, I'm just here to execute the order." "I'm not refusing your order," Eleanor said. She kept her voice pleasant. "I'm asking you to explain it to me, which is my right under the same law you're citing. If you search this property, I want to understand what you're looking for, so that I can tell you clearly whether it's here, which will save us all time." She looked at him steadily. "I have 8 children in this house, Mr. Hollis, and I am their only responsible adult at present. I would appreciate efficiency." He searched the house. She let him, because she had to, and because the evidence was gone. She walked behind him through every room. Through the kitchen and the front room and the upstairs bedrooms, where the children sat in careful rows on their beds and watched the strangers move through their things. Through her own room, where Hollis pressed on the walls and got down on his hands and knees and looked under the bed and went through the trunk with his hands, lifting the children's clothes one piece at a time, and found nothing underneath them but the bare bottom of the trunk. He searched the barn, the bunkhouse, the outbuildings. It took 3 hours. When he came back to the front of the house, his face had the look of a man who has found what he expected to find, which was nothing, and is now having to recalibrate what that means. "Are you satisfied?" Eleanor said. "For now," he said. She watched them ride back down the drive in the thinning snow, and Cord came to stand beside her on the porch, and neither of them said anything for a while. "They'll be back," Cord said finally. "I know. And next time they'll have more than a search order." "I know that too." Eleanor tracked the riders until they cleared the tree line and disappeared onto the main road. "But next time, I'm hoping we'll have something they don't." She went inside and told the children they could come downstairs and resume their day. She sat at the kitchen table and did not let herself think about the mountain pass. She counted instead. Hours. Miles. The distance between here and Denver and how fast a boy on a good horse could cover it and what a federal marshal might do when a 15-year-old kid showed up at his office with a tin box full of evidence and a letter from a woman he'd never heard of. She counted and she waited, and the snow outside slowed and stopped. The days after the search had a particular quality to them, the quality of a held breath, of something stretched tight and waiting to snap. Eleanor ran the ranch. That was the only way she knew how to describe what she did in those days. She ran it. She got up before the hands did and went to bed after the children were settled, and in between she managed the livestock counts and the feed stores and the household accounts and the 100 small crises that a working ranch generated daily without caring whether the man who owned it was sitting in a jail cell in town. She did it because it needed doing and because staying busy was the only thing standing between her and the kind of fear that, if you let it, would sit down on your chest and refuse to move. Cord helped. He was a man who understood what it meant to hold a thing together under pressure. She could see that he'd done it before. In other circumstances she didn't know and didn't ask about. He managed the hands with minimal friction, kept the watch rotation on the road without making it obvious, and appeared at Eleanor's elbow at precisely the moment she needed a second opinion, and disappeared again once he'd given it. What she didn't do was go into town. She wanted to. She wanted to walk into that courthouse and put herself in front of Victor Blackwell, and make clear to him exactly what she thought of men who arrested other men on fabricated murder charges. But Gideon had told her not to fight it, and she understood why. And so she stayed on the ranch and cooked meals and helped Hannah with the letters she was learning and fixed a piece of fence that had come loose on the east pasture, and did not go into town. On the fourth day, Annalisa came to her. The postmistress arrived in a wagon driven by her brother-in-law, a man who had no apparent connection to anyone in the Blackwell operation and therefore moved through town without attracting particular attention. Eleanor saw the wagon coming and went out to meet it, and Annalise climbed down with the careful movements of someone who had been sitting in the cold for a long time and was feeling it. "He's alive," was the first thing Annalisa said. "I saw him through the courthouse window yesterday. He's in the holding room on the ground floor. They're feeding him." Eleanor let out a slow breath. "Thank you. Blackwell has been to the courthouse every day. He's not acting like a man who's worried, which worries me." Annalise looked around the yard, at the hands visible near the barn, at the tracks in the snow from Hollis's visit, at the general evidence of a household managing under strain. "What's happening?" "Caleb went to Denver," Eleanor said. "He left the night before Gideon was arrested. He has the evidence." Annalise went very still. "You found it," she said. "Clara hid it in the back bedroom wall." "It was there the whole time." Eleanor paused. "The wall panel. There was a clean patch where something had been taken down. I noticed it when I moved in." Annalise closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, they were very bright. "She was always like that," she said softly. "She'd leave herself these little," she called them breadcrumbs, "things she could follow back if she needed to, in case she forgot where she'd put something." She stopped. "She never got to follow them back." "No," Eleanor said, "but someone did." They stood there in the cold yard for a moment, and Eleanor felt, not for the first time, the presence of Clara Cross in a way that wasn't supernatural or fanciful. Just the feeling of inhabiting the consequence of another person's choices, of living inside the space that a life had made. "How long until your son gets back?" Annalisa asked. If the marshal moved quickly, if Caleb reached him and he understood the situation and started immediately, 10 days, maybe 12. She did the arithmetic as she said it, the way she'd been doing it every hour since Caleb left, possibly longer. "Blackwell won't wait that long," Annalisa said. "He's been asking around town, asking about you, about what you might know." She met Eleanor's eyes. "He's trying to figure out if Gideon told you where the evidence was. He doesn't know you found it, but he's circling. What does he do when he figures out we have it?" "I don't know. I've never seen him lose before." Annalise pulled her coat tighter. "I think that's what scares me. I know what he does when he wins. I don't know what he does when the ground shifts under him." Eleanor thought about that for the rest of the day. On the 6th day, Thomas came to her. He found her in the barn after supper, checking on a mare that had been off her feed. He came in without a lantern, which meant he'd been thinking about this long enough to know he didn't want anyone to see him coming, and he stood in the dim light from Eleanor's lamp with his hands in his coat pockets and a careful expression on his face. "I want to go to the courthouse," he said, "to see Gideon." Eleanor kept her hands on the mare's neck. "Why?" "Because nobody's been." Because he doesn't know what's happening out here. Because he stopped and restarted. Because it's the right thing to do, and I think it might also be useful. She looked at him. Useful how? Because if I go, just me, a 14-year-old boy visiting Mr. Cross, it's unremarkable. Nobody looks at it twice. But I can tell him that Caleb got through, that help is coming, and I can see how he is. She thought about this. Blackwell will hear about it. Blackwell already knows we're here. He doesn't care about a boy visiting the man who's about to marry his mother. Thomas said it plainly, without self-consciousness. It's not threatening, it's just human. Eleanor looked at her son, 14, with his father's jaw and her mother's stubborn eyes, and something in the set of his shoulders that was entirely his own, and thought about how little time had passed since he was small enough to carry. Tomorrow morning, she said, early. Cord will go with you. I don't need... Cord goes with you, she said. He waits outside. That's not negotiable. Thomas looked like he was going to argue, and then he looked at her face, and he didn't. Okay, he said. Thomas came back from town in the early afternoon. Eleanor was at the kitchen table working through the ranch accounts when she heard the wagon come in. She'd taken up keeping the accounts partly because they needed keeping, and partly because numbers gave her mind something to grip while the rest of her waited. She went to the door. Thomas came in looking different than he'd left. Not badly different, just altered in some specific way that she associated with the look of a person who had gone somewhere and come back having learned something they hadn't expected. She poured him coffee and sat back down and waited. He's okay, Thomas said. He wrapped both hands around the cup. He looks tired, and his cell is cold, but he's okay. Did you tell him? I told him Caleb got through, that help was on its way. He looked down at the cup. He didn't say much, he sat there for a minute, and then he said to tell you to hold on. Eleanor kept her face neutral. Anything else? He said... Thomas stopped, seemed to be choosing the right words for something. He said to tell you he was sorry for bringing you into this. The kitchen was quiet for a moment. Outside, one of the younger children was shouting something in the yard. George, she thought, in the middle of some territorial dispute with Daniel that had been going on since Tuesday. He didn't bring me into anything, Eleanor said. I told him that too, Thomas said. I told him you'd say that. She looked at her son. What else? She said, because she could still see something on his face, something he was still holding. He set the cup down. When I came out of the courthouse, Blackwell was there, on the steps. He said it carefully. He didn't stop me. He was there, and he looked at me. And then he said, very politely, that he hoped my mother was settling in well and that Blackstone Valley was treating our family kindly. He paused. And then he said he looked forward to having a conversation with her soon. Eleanor's hands went still on the table. He said that specifically, she said. A conversation with her? Yes. Not with you, not a general pleasantry. Specifically with me. Yes. She absorbed this. Blackwell knew, maybe not what she had, not that the evidence was gone, but he knew that she was the relevant person, that whatever was happening, she was driving it. All right, she said. She picked up the pen again. Thank you for going. Thomas looked at her. Are you worried? Yes, she said. Now go eat something and check on your sister. Hannah's been at Marta all afternoon and Marta's running out of patience. He went. She sat with the account book open and the pen in her hand and didn't write anything for a while. On the 9th day, she went to town herself. Not because she'd planned to, because on the morning of the 9th day, Cord came in before breakfast and told her that a man named Reeves, one of the other names from Clara's diagrams, a man who held a position in the Territorial Land Commission, had arrived in Blackstone Valley the previous evening and gone directly to Blackwell's house, and that the two of them had been seen that morning coming out together and going into the courthouse, and they'd had the look of men finalizing something. Cord said this, and Eleanor listened, and then she said she was going to town. Mrs. Hartwell, Cord said. I know, she said. He's expecting you. I know that too. Cord was quiet for a moment. Then at least let me drive you. She took Agnes with her. Not out of sentiment. Agnes was 12 and competent, and having her there would reinforce the image of a woman running a normal household errand, not a woman going to town to look a corrupt judge in the eye. Agnes could do her job and not ask too many questions, and if she did ask questions, she was old enough to handle partial answers. They went to the general store first. Eleanor bought flour and lamp oil and a piece of blue ribbon that Hannah had mentioned wanting, and she did it slowly and pleasantly, and spoke to two women she recognized from previous visits and said nothing of particular interest to any of them. She was coming out of the store when Blackwell stepped off the sidewalk on the other side of the street and crossed toward her. He was dressed well, as always. His coat was good broadcloth, dark blue with brass buttons. He removed his hat when he reached her, which was the gesture of a man performing courtesy, so automatic that the performance had become invisible to him. "Mrs. Hartwell," he said, "I was hoping we might speak." "Of course," Eleanor said pleasantly. She handed Agnes the parcels. "Agnes, take these to the wagon, please. I'll be just a moment." Agnes went, with one of her particular sidelong looks that said she was cataloging everything for later analysis. Eleanor turned back to Blackwell. He looked at her with those light-colored eyes. Up close, in full daylight, they were gray-green, the color of water under cloud cover, which she supposed was appropriate. "How are your children settling in?" he asked. "Very well, thank you. A large family is a good thing," he said. "Stability, roots." He paused. "I imagine you've had a difficult few weeks with Mr. Cross's legal situation." "Mr. Cross is innocent," Eleanor said. "I expect that will become clear in short order." Something moved behind the gray-green eyes. "The law must take its course, of course. I'm sure you understand that." "I understand the law quite well," Eleanor said. "I've been familiarizing myself with territorial statutes recently. It's been an educational exercise." A small silence. "Has it?" Blackwell said. "Yes. I found it particularly interesting, but the statutes regarding federal oversight of territorial courts, the circumstances under which federal jurisdiction supersedes local authority." She kept her voice conversational. Instructive reading. He was very still. The hat was still in his hand. He turned it once, slowly, the way a man turns something when his hands want to do something and he's telling them not to. "Mrs. Hartwell," he said, and his voice had dropped the pleasantry, not entirely, but enough that she could hear the difference. "I think you may have formed some misunderstandings about the situation here, about how things work in this territory. I would hate for those misunderstandings to cause problems for your family." "I appreciate the concern," Eleanor said. "My family is fine. For now," he said. She held his eyes. She had prepared herself for this. Not the exact words, but the shape of them, the weight of what was underneath them. She'd thought about it in the dark for 8 nights. "Judge Blackwell," she said quietly, "I want to be very honest with you. I think you're a careful man, and I think you prefer honesty to misunderstanding, so I'll give it to you directly. You cannot threaten me with my children. I don't mean that I'm brave. I mean that threatening my children makes me more determined, not less. That's not a strategy. That's just how I'm built." She watched him process that. Whatever he'd expected her to say, it wasn't that. "I think," she continued in the same quiet tone, "that you should focus your attention in the coming days on how you'd like to conduct yourself when circumstances change. Because they will change. And when they do, how you've behaved up to that point will matter." He looked at her for a long moment. "You're a confident woman," he said finally. "I'm a realistic one," she said. "Good morning, Judge." She walked to the wagon without looking back and climbed up and took the reins from Agnes and turned the horse toward home. Agnes sat beside her in silence for about 3 minutes, which was approximately her limit. "What was that about?" she said. "Nothing that concerns you yet," Eleanor said. "Yet?" Agnes repeated, with the precision of a 12-year-old who has learned that yet is the most informative word in any sentence. "Eat your ribbon," Eleanor said, and Agnes looked down at the blue ribbon in her hands, and then looked back at Eleanor with an expression of profound exasperation that was so completely herself that Eleanor felt something in her chest loosen just slightly. They rode home through the cold. On the 11th day, Caleb came back. He came with 8 men. Eleanor was at the front of the house when she heard them, a group of riders coming up the ranch drive at a pace that was controlled but purposeful, and even before she could count them, she knew, because the sound of it was different from the sound of threat. Threat moved differently. She'd learned that in the past 11 days. She came off the porch and was halfway to the drive when Caleb separated from the group and rode toward her, and she stopped and looked at her son. He was filthy. He was exhausted. There was a cut along his left jaw that had been treated and was healing. His horse looked like it had been through exactly the journey it had been through. He dismounted when he reached her and stood there, and she put her hands on his face, the same way she'd done when he left, and he let her, which meant he was very tired, and looked at him. "You made it," she said. "I made it," he said. His voice was rougher than usual. "The pass was bad. There was a section. I had to walk the horse through about a mile of it." He paused. "I fell twice." She looked at the cut on his jaw. "That's from the second one," he said. "It's fine." She made herself let go of his face and turned to look at the riders coming up the drive. 8 men, all with the specific bearing of federal authority. Not aggressive, not showy, just the bearing of people who are accustomed to being taken seriously in difficult places. The man at the front was perhaps 50, with a gray mustache and the kind of face that had been exposed to significant weather over a long career, and had come through it with the specific quality of someone who isn't particularly interested in being noticed but tends to be noticed anyway. He reined up and looked at Eleanor. "Mrs. Hartwell?" he said. "Yes." "Marshal Aldrich Raines, Federal Circuit, Denver District." He didn't dismount yet. "Your boy here tells me you have a situation." "We do," she said. "Will you come inside?" "In a few minutes." He looked toward the road toward town. "First I need to understand the current geography. The man in custody. He's in the courthouse?" "Yes." "And the judge who put him there?" "Also at the courthouse, as a rule. Or his house 2 streets over." Raines nodded. He turned to one of his deputies and said something short and specific. The deputy nodded and peeled off with 2 men toward the road. "I've sent them to secure the courthouse," Raines told Eleanor. "No one goes in or out until we've assessed the situation." He dismounted then, methodically, like a man who has dismounted from horses approximately 10,000 times and sees no reason to make a production of it. "Now, I'll come inside." Eleanor led him in. She put coffee on because her hands needed something to do, and also because marshals who had ridden from Denver in response to a letter from a woman they'd never met seemed like men who might appreciate coffee. Raines sat at the kitchen table and Eleanor laid out everything, the same organized account she'd been giving to herself in her head for weeks. The version that started with Gideon's letter and worked forward through Annalise and the tin box, and Caleb's ride, and the search, and the days of waiting. She told it without editorializing, as close to a simple sequence of facts as she could manage. Raines listened. He was very good at listening, the kind of listener who made you feel that what you were saying was being actually absorbed, rather than just heard. When she finished, he said, "The tin box, the original evidence." "Caleb had it," Eleanor said. She looked at her son, who was sitting at the far end of the table with his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee and his eyes at about half-mast from exhaustion. "I gave it to him on the second day," Caleb said. "Soon as I got there and he was satisfied I wasn't. He wanted to verify." He looked at Raines. "He spent 2 days going through it." "I did," Raines confirmed. He turned back to Eleanor. "It's compelling. I won't call it airtight until my people have had more time with it, but it's substantially more than I expected. The original land records alone—" He paused. "The woman who compiled this was meticulous." "Yes," Eleanor said. "She was." He looked at her for a moment. "She's the reason I came," he said. "I'll be straight with you. I've heard of Blackwell, not formally, nothing that ever rose to a federal matter. But his name has come up in a context or two that I didn't like. I filed it away." He picked up his coffee cup. "When your son arrived with a box full of original documents and a letter that laid out a 43-family operation in clear detail, I decided it was time to stop filing things away." "What happens now?" Eleanor asked. "Now I go to the courthouse and have a conversation with Judge Blackwell." He set the cup down. "And then I release your man." Mom, she couldn't go. She knew she couldn't go. Someone had to be at the ranch with the children, and Cord wasn't in a position to manage the release and the arrest simultaneously, and beyond logistics, Raines had made it clear in the gentle way of a man used to managing civilians that the courthouse was not the place for her right now. She understood. She sat in the kitchen and waited, Thomas paced the front room until Eleanor told him to stop, and he went outside and paced the yard instead. The younger children, who knew something momentous was happening but not what, had settled into an unusual cooperative quiet that Eleanor suspected owed more to Agnes's management than to any natural instinct. Marta made bread. When things were uncertain, Marta made bread. Eleanor had observed that this was not displacement. It was a kind of anchoring, a way of insisting that ordinary life was still happening and would continue to happen. 2 hours passed. 3. At the end of the 3rd hour, Eleanor heard horses again. She was on the porch before she'd consciously decided to move. Gideon was on a horse she didn't recognize, a borrowed animal, she supposed, since his own horse had been left in town when they arrested him. He was riding with 3 of Raines's deputies, and he looked like a man who had spent 11 days in a cold room and was now in the open air for the first time, and was managing that transition with characteristic economy of expression. He came through the gate and dismounted and looked at Eleanor. She walked toward him. He walked toward her. They met in the middle of the yard, and she stopped in front of him and looked at his face, at the 11 days on it, at the gauntness around his jaw and the dark under his eyes, and the something else underneath all of it that she didn't have a name for yet. "I told you to hold on," he said. "I know," she said. "I did." He put his hand on her shoulder. Just his hand, just for a moment, and she felt the weight of it, the straightforward, uncomplicated realness of it, and she thought about how little she'd allowed herself to notice what she'd been carrying for 11 days, because noticing it would have made it harder to keep going. Now, with him standing here, she let herself notice it. "The children," he said. "All fine. All here. Caleb made it." "Yes, he's inside. He's going to sleep for about 2 days." Something moved across Gideon's face. She had a feeling she knew what it was, like the feeling of something you've been bracing for not coming, the structural adjustment that happens when you've been holding yourself tight for a long time and you're allowed, finally, to ease up. "Your son," he said, "rode through a mountain pass in a blizzard." "He's 50, Eleanor said. "They have poor judgment about risk. It usually works out." Gideon looked at her. Something that wasn't quite a smile, but was in the vicinity of one, crossed his face for the first time since she'd met him. "Come inside," she said. "Marta's been making bread for 6 hours, and it needs to be eaten." But the next 3 days were not clean. She wasn't sure what she'd expected. Justice arriving meant it arrived, and that would be that. But justice in practice turned out to be a complicated, procedural, often unsatisfying process that happened in pieces. Raines and his deputies worked systematically through the courthouse, cataloging what they found. 2 of Blackwell's associates, Hollis and one of the land office men, were taken into custody on the first day without significant incident. A 3rd man, the one named Reeves, who'd arrived just before everything broke open, had apparently read the situation with some intelligence and attempted to leave town quietly the night of the arrests. Pete, the young ranch hand, had been watching this road as instructed by Cord and had alerted Raines's men, who intercepted Reeves on the south road before he'd gotten 2 miles. Blackwell himself was arrested on the first morning. Eleanor wasn't there to see it. She heard about it from Annalise, who had been, she suspected deliberately, in a position to observe it from the post office window, and who came to the ranch that afternoon to tell her. "He came out of the courthouse when they called him," Annalise said. "He was very composed. He argued that they had no federal jurisdiction in the territory, which Raines ignored, and then he said the evidence was fraudulently obtained, which Raines also ignored, and then Raines read him the specific charges." She stopped for a moment. "He stopped arguing after that. There were a lot of charges." "And?" Eleanor said. "And they took him." Annalisa looked out the kitchen window. He looked at the courthouse on the way out, just looked at it, like he was memorizing it, like he thought he'd be back. She turned back to Eleanor. "He's not coming back." Eleanor nodded. "Clara's evidence held up," Annalisa said. It wasn't a question exactly, more like something she needed to say in order to hear it said. "Raines seems to think so," Eleanor said. "He told Gideon it's the most complete documentation he's seen in a territorial corruption case. She'd done the work of a trained investigator." Annalisa sat very still for a moment. She would have liked knowing that, she said quietly. She always worried that she might have missed something, that it wouldn't be enough. It was enough. Eleanor said. It was more than enough. They sat with that for a while, the two of them, in the kitchen where the bread was done and cooling on the rack and the fire was warm, and somewhere in the house children were making the normal sounds of their ordinary lives. On the fourth day, everything broke at once, and not cleanly. Eleanor was in the yard when Cord came at the controlled trot she'd learned to read as the signal for something has happened that needs your attention now. Blackwell escaped, he said. She stared at him. What? Sometime in the night, they had him in the courthouse holding room, same room Gideon was in, apparently, and in the morning, he was gone. Cord's voice was flat with the deliberate flatness of a man setting aside his own feelings about this because there's no time for them. Raines has men on the roads. He's not gone far. There was snow last night, and his tracks were clear going east toward the mountains. Eleanor stood in the yard in the cold morning air and felt the ground shift under everything she'd built in the past 2 weeks. They hadn't finished. They were close. Close enough that she'd let herself, just slightly, just in the small hours of the past 2 nights, believe they might be done. That the worst of it had passed. That what came next was the slower, less dangerous work of testimony and legal process, and the careful reconstruction of 43 families' stolen lives. She had been wrong. She went inside and found Gideon. He was already in the front room. Cord had clearly sent someone in ahead. He had his coat on, and his expression was the specific one she'd come to recognize as him, making a decision he was not going to discuss. No, she said. He looked at her. You're not going after him alone, she said. Raines has men on the roads. Let them— Raines's men don't know these mountains, he said. Blackwell has been in this territory for 15 years. He knows every trail, every canyon, every place to go to ground. He looked at her with an expression that was not argument and not apology, just the flat fact of something he'd already decided. If we wait for Raines's men to figure out the terrain, Blackwell is gone. He gets across the mountain and he reaches whatever he has set up on the other side. Money, passage, connections, and we never see him again. Eleanor stood in the doorway and looked at this man she'd known for 6 weeks, in whose house she'd settled her children, whose wife's evidence had been the linchpin of everything. And she thought about the tin box and the 43 families and the 3 people who'd died cold winters that didn't have to kill them. And she thought about Clara Cross, who hadn't been able to finish what she started. I'm going with you, she said. Eleanor, the children are safe here, she said. Raines has men at the courthouse and on the roads. Cord is here. Marta is here. Thomas is 14 and he's more capable than he looks. She met his eyes. I'm going with you. He looked at her for a long moment. You've never tracked anyone in mountain terrain, he said. No, she agreed. But you have. So you do that part, and I'll do the other part. What other part? The part where someone talks to him, Eleanor said. When we find him. Gideon was quiet. He'll be afraid, she said. A man like Blackwell, all of this power, and now it's gone, and he's cold, and he's running, and everything he spent 15 years building is done. He'll be afraid. And afraid men do stupid things. She paused. I've been talking to difficult men my whole life. I can talk to one more. A long silence. He's dangerous, Gideon said. Yes, she said. So am I, when my children's future is at stake. He looked at her for one more moment, and then he turned and went to get the horses. They found Blackwell's trail where Cord had said, going east toward the mountain pass that wasn't the pass Caleb had used. A lower, narrower route that Gideon knew and that Blackwell apparently knew too. The tracks were clear in the new snow. One horse, moving fast at first and then slower, the horse tiring on the grade. Eleanor rode beside Gideon and kept her eyes on the terrain. She had not been on mountain trails before. Not like this, not with the grade steepening under the horse and the tree cover thinning and the rock faces starting to push through the snow on either side. It was not smooth riding. She didn't say anything about that. They rode for 4 hours. At the second hour, the trail veered off the main pass route into a side canyon that Gideon had been watching for, and he pulled up and looked at it. There's an old trapper's cabin, he said, about 2 miles in. Used to belong to a man named Cutter. He died 9 years ago, and the cabin's been empty since. It's known. He looked at Eleanor. If Blackwell knows about it, it would be exactly the kind of place he'd make for. Known to who else? Eleanor asked. People who've been here long enough. He paused. Raines's people won't know it. They went in. The canyon was narrow and the light came down through it at a steep angle that made the snow look blue in the shadows. Eleanor's horse picked its way carefully, reading the terrain better than she was, and she let it. She kept her eyes on the tracks. The cabin appeared around a bend in the canyon wall. Small, dark logs. A chimney that had smoke coming from it. Thin smoke. He'd only been here a few hours and hadn't built it up much, which meant he was either cold or being cautious about visibility. She looked at Gideon. "He's in there," he said very quietly. "Yes." They stopped the horses and dismounted and tied them in the tree cover. Gideon checked the rifle he'd brought, one efficient motion, and Eleanor adjusted her coat and her gloves and stood in the cold canyon light and thought about what she was about to do. "Stay behind me until I've assessed it," Gideon said. "I'll stay beside you," Eleanor said. He looked at her. "Beside you," she repeated. He let out a breath. "All right." They walked to the cabin door and Gideon knocked on it. Not tentatively. Knock of someone who is there and is not leaving. Silence inside. Then movement. The door opened. Blackwell looked like 3 weeks of careful composure that had finally run out. His coat was dirty. He hadn't slept. The careful confidence she'd seen on the main street, that layered, practiced quality of a man entirely in control of how he was perceived, was fractured now, and what was underneath it was not what Eleanor had expected. What was underneath it was a person who had been powerful for so long that the absence of power had hollocked him out from the inside. He looked at Gideon, then he looked at Eleanor. She looked back. "May we come in?" she said. Blackwell stepped back from the door. It wasn't quite an invitation. It wasn't quite a refusal either. It was the movement of a man who had run out of options and was still, even now, trying to find the angle that left him with something. Eleanor recognized it because she'd seen it in men her whole life, that last-minute recalculation, the refusal to simply stop. She went in anyway. Gideon followed. The cabin was exactly what it looked like from outside. One room, a stone fireplace with a small fire, a cot along one wall, a table with one chair. The kind of shelter that had been built for function and nothing else. It smelled like cold ash and pine pitch, and the closed-in smell of a place that hadn't been aired in years before someone lit a fire in it today. Blackwell stood near the fireplace. He still had his coat on. His hat was on the table, which was the first time she'd seen him without it, and it made him look different, smaller somehow, more like an ordinary person. He looked at Eleanor with an expression that was hard to categorize, so not fear, not contempt, not the practiced pleasantness she'd seen from him before. Something raw. The expression of someone whose performance has finally run completely out of fuel. "You followed the tracks," he said. "Gideon knows these mountains," Eleanor said. "He's lived here longer than you have." Blackwell's eyes moved to Gideon. Something passed between them. Not words, not quite acknowledgement. The specific look of two men who have been circling each other for 2 years and have finally run out of space to circle in. "It's over," Gideon said. It wasn't a threat, just a statement, delivered in the same flat tone he delivered most things. "Is it?" Blackwell said. "Your associates are in federal custody," Eleanor said. "The courthouse has been turned over to Marshal Raines. The evidence Clara compiled is in federal hands and has been reviewed." She paused. "There is no version of this where you ride somewhere and start again." Blackwell looked at the fire for a moment. He put his hand on the mantelpiece, just rested it there, like he needed something solid to touch. "How much did she have?" he said. "Clara." Eleanor glanced at Gideon. He gave the smallest nod. "Everything," Eleanor said. "Original land records, letters between you and the investors, the ledger, survey documents with the alterations marked." She watched his face. She was thorough. A long silence. The fire shifted and settled. "She came to see me," Blackwell said, "toward the end. I didn't know then what she'd built, but I knew she was close to something. She sat in my office, and she looked at me." He stopped. His jaw worked. "She looked at me the way you're looking at me now, like she'd already seen the verdict and was just waiting for the rest of the world to catch up." Eleanor said nothing. "I told myself it was necessary," Blackwell said, "what I did. That the territory needed a certain kind of order, a certain kind of stability, and that the people who had the capacity to create it, the men with capital, with connections, that their interests were ultimately the territory's interests. He said it the way a man recites something he's said so many times it's worn smooth, like a stone in a riverbed. And then he seemed to hear it himself, the way it sounded coming out of his mouth in a cold cabin with nowhere left to run, and something in his face changed. I knew it wasn't true. I knew it from the beginning. He stopped. You just decided your version of the truth was good enough, Eleanor said quietly. He looked at her. Men like you always do, she said. Not cruelly, just as the fact it was. You find the logic that lets you sleep, and you repeat it until it feels like principle. But the 43 families who lost their land, they didn't get to choose a version. They just lost. Blackwell's hand dropped from the mantelpiece. He seemed to fold slightly, a subtle decrease in the architecture of his posture, like a structure that has had a keystone removed. 3 of them died, Eleanor said. Did you know that? Clara documented it. 3 people who lost their land and their livelihood and didn't make it through the next winter. They're in the ledger too. He said nothing. The ones who survived are still here, she said, still in this territory, working land that was taken from them or living on charity from neighbors who didn't have much to spare. She looked at him steadily. The original documents Clara gathered are enough to reverse the fraudulent transfers. Every family can have their land returned. The trials will take time, but the evidence is sufficient. All of that can happen if you cooperate with federal investigators and provide a full account of the mechanism. Every name, every transaction, every instruction you gave. He looked at her for a long moment. You're offering me something. I'm telling you what the difference is, she said, between a man who fought federal charges every step of the way and a man who cooperated fully. The sentences will be different. The process will be different. And the families will get their land back faster, which is the part I care about. It wasn't mercy. She wasn't offering mercy, and she wasn't pretending to. She was offering him a choice between 2 versions of a consequence he was going to face regardless. And she was being clear about the difference between them because being unclear would only cost those 43 families more time. Blackwell looked at Gideon again. And you? He said. What do you want? Gideon was quiet for a moment. I want you to tell the federal investigators exactly what happened to Clara, he said. Everything. Who made the decision and who carried it out and how? A long silence. That will mean naming names, Blackwell said. People with money and reach, back east. I know, Gideon said. Another silence. Then Blackwell reached into his coat, slowly, with the deliberate movements of a man who understands that slow is wise right now, and brought out a folded set of papers. He set them on the table. I've been carrying these for 2 days, he said. I kept thinking I'd destroy them, and then I kept not doing it. He looked down at them. They're the investment records. The 4 men Clara couldn't fully document. Their names are in here with full transaction records. I kept a copy for exactly this kind of moment. Insurance. He made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. Against the wrong people. Turns out the wrong people were the ones with the federal badges. Eleanor looked at the papers on the table. Then she looked at Gideon. He crossed to the table and picked them up and looked at them. She watched his face. Is it enough? She said. It's more than enough, he said. They rode back down to the canyon with Blackwell between them, his hands tied in front with a length of rope that Gideon had brought with the straightforward practicality of a man who had thought through what they were going into. The ride down was longer than the ride up, or felt that way. The silence between the 3 of them carrying its own particular weight. Eleanor rode and looked at the mountains around her and thought about what had just happened in that cabin, and what it did and didn't resolve. It resolved the legal question. It resolved the evidence question. It started the clock on 43 land returns, and whatever federal cases would follow against the investors back east. It gave Gideon what he'd needed for 2 years. The acknowledgement, the naming of names, the beginning of an official record that said Clara Cross had not died in an accident. What it didn't resolve was the grief. She'd understood that walking in. Justice and grief were not the same currency, and you couldn't trade one for the other. Gideon would carry what had happened to Clara for the rest of his life, in the specific way that you carry the loss of someone whose death didn't have to happen. The weight of that didn't get lighter because the man responsible was now riding tied between them in a canyon in the mountains. It just became a different shape of weight. She thought about that, and she let herself think about it, which was something she'd been careful not to do for 6 weeks because there hadn't been space for it. Now there was a little space. Not a lot, but some. Raines was waiting at the bottom of the canyon road with 2 of his deputies and the expression of a man who had been managing his relief at not having to organize a mountain search. He looked at Blackwell, then at Eleanor and Gideon, then back at Blackwell. "You found him," he said. Gideon knew where to look, Eleanor said. Raines took custody of Blackwell with the efficient practicality of a federal officer who has done this before. He said something to Blackwell that Eleanor didn't hear, and Blackwell responded in a tone that was different from any tone she'd heard from him. Quieter, with the flatness of a man who has stopped performing. Before they rode out, Raines pulled his horse alongside Eleanor's. "The papers he had," he said. "Gideon tells me they complete the picture." "That's my understanding," Eleanor said. Raines looked at her for a moment. He had the kind of eyes that assessed things without making a show of it. "You did good work here, Mrs. Hartwell. You and your boy, both of you." Eleanor thought about Caleb on a mountain trail in a blizzard, walking a horse through a section of impassable snow in the dark. She thought about Thomas going to that courthouse with his jaw set like his father's. She thought about Agnes running the household with the authority of a general and the vocabulary of someone who had strong opinions about everything. "My family did good work," she said. Raines nodded and rode. The trials took 7 months. They happened in a federal court 3 territories over, which meant Blackwell was out of his own jurisdiction entirely, and the judge who presided was a woman named Oakes, who Raines said had a reputation for thoroughness that made Blackwell's own methodical nature look like casual effort. Eleanor testified, Gideon testified, Annalise testified, with the particular composure of a woman who had been waiting to say these things for 2 years. Caleb was asked to give an account of his ride and how he'd come to carry the evidence. And he did it in the flat, factual way he did most things. And several people in the courtroom looked at him with an expression Eleanor recognized as reappraisal. Blackwell cooperated, as promised. He gave the names of the 4 Eastern investors, the full transaction record, and a detailed account of the operation's mechanism going back to its origins. He also, and this was the part that cost him visibly, the part that didn't come out flat or practiced, gave a full account of what had happened to Clara Cross. Who had made the decision, who had carried it out. The 2 men involved were both named and both charged. Gideon sat in the courtroom for that testimony with his hands flat on the table in front of him and his face entirely still. Eleanor sat beside him. She didn't try to say anything or do anything. She just stayed there, which was sometimes the only useful thing a person could do. Blackwell was sentenced to 22 years. The 2 men responsible for Clara's death received life sentences. The 4 Eastern investors were prosecuted in their own jurisdictions the following year and received sentences that, while shorter than Eleanor thought they deserved, were public and documented and attached to their names permanently. The land reversals began within 60 days of the initial verdicts. A federal land commissioner came to Blackstone Valley and set up temporary offices in the courthouse, Blackwell's old courthouse, with its neat brass fittings and its smell of good wood and power, and began the systematic process of reviewing each of the 43 affected families' cases. Most of them got their land back. Some of the land had been resold and the recovery was more complicated. Those cases took longer and the resolutions were more partial. But the federal compensation mechanism that Raines helped put in place covered the gap for most families. Eleanor watched this happen, case by case, from the ranch. She wasn't part of the official process, but Annalise kept her informed, and sometimes families who'd gotten their land back came to the ranch to thank Gideon, and by extension her, and she'd make coffee and let them say what they needed to say and not make a production of any of it. One afternoon, an older man named Perot, who'd lost his family's homestead 5 years prior and had been working as a hand on land adjoining his own former claim, came and sat at the kitchen table and told her that he'd gotten the papers back that week and that he planned to rebuild the house in spring. "It'll be rough the first year," he said. He was matter-of-fact about it in the way of a man who has had practice being matter-of-fact about hard things. "The land's been worked differently, and I'll need to adjust. But it's mine." "Yes," Eleanor said. "It is." He looked at her. "There were people who could have moved on this a long time ago and didn't," he said. "I'm not saying that as blame. I know it was complicated. I'm just saying you did something that a lot of people decided was too hard or too dangerous." Eleanor thought about what to say. She thought about Clara Cross and the tin box and the clean patch on the wall. She thought about a 15-year-old boy walking a horse through a blizzard. "We had help," she said, "from someone who started the work a long time before we did." Perrault nodded. He understood who she meant. He rebuilt his house that spring, and Eleanor saw the smoke from its chimney on clear days from the east-facing window upstairs, a thin line of ordinary life rising into the cold morning air. Abdubbed. The wedding happened in March. Not the elaborate version. Neither of them wanted that. And beyond preference, a large ceremony in Blackstone Valley, in the middle of a federal investigation, would have been strange in a way that nobody needed. It was small, the family, Annalise, Cord, Marta, Owen, and the Hands, and a circuit judge named Farrow who had known Gideon for years and had a face that suggested he'd seen most things and found almost none of them surprising. Eleanor stood in the front room of the ranch house with 8 of her children arranged around her in various degrees of formal behavior. Rosie had already lost her ribbon twice and had given up on finding it. James had been bribed with the promise of being allowed to name the new calf. Agnes stood with her arms folded and the expression of a person who considers the proceedings both important and slightly beneath her dignity, which Eleanor took as a sign of deep investment. And she looked at Gideon Cross standing across from her and thought about the letter she'd received in Missouri in the worst month of her life. "I am not a young man, and I make no pretense of romance." He had not pretended to romance. What he had done was something she hadn't thought to want or plan for, something harder to name and harder to build and considerably more durable. He had been honest with her. He had trusted her with the truth when it would have been easier not to. He had watched her children ride his horses and fill his house with noise, and gradually, without fanfare, had stopped acting like a man who was tolerating things and started acting like a man who was home. She had not come here looking for that. She'd come here looking for survival, for a place to put her children through the winter, for the blunt arithmetic of need meeting need. She had gotten something more complicated and considerably more real, and she was still working out what to do with it, and she suspected she'd be working it out for a long time. Judge Farrow read the words, and they said what they needed to say. And Rosie found her ribbon, and James cried a little and then denied it, and Marta made a cake that was extraordinary under the circumstances of having been made in a frontier kitchen in March, with limited ingredients, and Gideon put his hand in Eleanor's and she held it, and that was that. After, when the house had settled and the children were in bed, and the last of the small celebration had wound down, Eleanor and Gideon sat on the porch in the cold in their coats with 2 cups of coffee, looking out at the yard and the dark pasture beyond it and the mountains past that. It wasn't comfortable exactly. It was March, and frontier porches are not built for comfort. But it was theirs, and that was a different thing. "Perrault's house," Eleanor said. "You can see the smoke from the east window now." "I noticed," Gideon said. "More families will come back in spring, once word gets around about the reversals." "Yes." He turned his cup in his hands. "The valley is going to look different." She thought about that. "Better different." "Yes," he said. "Better." They sat there in this cold quiet, and Eleanor thought about what it meant, the actual texture of it, not the idea of it, to have arrived somewhere. She'd been moving for so long. Before the journey west even, moving through years of making do, of managing the gap between what was and what was needed, of holding a family together through the sheer force of not stopping. She was not a woman who rested easily. She didn't think she was about to become one. But this was hers, this house, this man beside her, this valley that was going to be better than it had been. The children upstairs making the small sounds of their sleeping. The smoke from Perrault's rebuilt house visible on clear mornings. The tin box that was now in federal custody in Denver. The evidence inside it having done the work that Clara Cross had died trying to do. She would have liked this, Eleanor said. She didn't need to say who. Gideon was quiet for a moment. "She'd have found something to fix," he said. Eleanor looked at him. "Something that wasn't right yet," he said. "She always did. She was never done." He said it without the grief she'd heard in him before when he talked about Clara, or not without it, but alongside it, in the way that grief settles when enough time and work has passed, when it becomes part of the architecture rather than the only room. She would have been glad the families got their land, and then she'd have found the next thing. "Maybe that's not so bad," Eleanor said. "Always finding the next thing." He looked at her sideways. something in his face that was, by now, familiar to her. The near smile, the acknowledgement of something he wasn't going to put into words. "No," he said. "Maybe not." Summer came to Blackstone Valley the way it always did. Gradually, and then all at once, the snow retreating up the mountain faces and the grass coming in green on the lower pastures and the days getting long in the way that long frontier days got. The sky so wide and so much the same color for so many hours that you stopped noticing where it ended. Caleb turned 16 in June. Eleanor made him a cake, which he was embarrassed about, and ate most of by himself over 2 days. He'd been helping Gideon with the cattle operation since spring and had developed, without quite realizing it, the same unhurried efficiency with ranch work that Gideon had. The quality of someone who was thinking about the next thing while he was doing this one. Not because he was impatient, but because he was always 3 steps ahead. Gideon had noticed it. He didn't say anything to Caleb directly, because that wasn't how he said things. But Eleanor had seen him watching the boy in the way you watch someone you're quietly reconsidering. Thomas, 15 now, had started corresponding with a school in the county seat about terms for the following year. Eleanor had thought he'd fight her on it. He'd taken on enough responsibility in the past 6 months that she'd worried he might decide he was done with being a student. Instead, he'd brought her the school's information himself and asked her what she thought, which was, in its way, exactly what she'd hoped for. Agnes ran the household with an authority that Marta had stopped challenging and now largely endorsed, working around it the way a river works around a rock that isn't moving. Agnes was 12 going on 40, and Eleanor had long since accepted that this was simply who she was. The 4 younger ones, Hannah, George, May, Daniel, had become ranch children in the way that children become what their environment teaches them to become, which is completely and without nostalgia for what they'd been before. They knew the horses by name and the hands by their habits, and the particular sound the gate made in summer versus the sound it made in winter. They knew this place. It had become the place they would remember when they were older and trying to explain where they came from. Rosie, 7 now and fully recovered from everything, had appointed herself the official chronicler of ranch life in a journal she'd started keeping with a stubby pencil in one of the blank ledgers Gideon had given her. It consisted primarily of daily weather reports, arguments witnessed, and detailed character assessments of the barn cats. Eleanor read it sometimes, with permission, and found it the most accurate document of daily life at the ranch that existed. On a morning in late July, Eleanor was in the kitchen with coffee when Gideon came in from the early work and sat down across from her, and they did what they did now in the mornings. Sat together for a while without requiring it to be anything other than what it was. "Annalise was here yesterday," Eleanor said, "while you were out." "What did she want?" "She wanted to tell me that a family named Colcord got their land decision finalized. Last of the 43. Gideon was quiet for a moment. "Last one," he said. "Last one," Eleanor confirmed. 43 families. Not an abstract number anymore. She knew most of them now, by name, by face, by the particular circumstances of what they'd lost and what they'd gotten back. Some of them were doing well. The land was theirs again, and the seasons were cooperating, and the work was hard but sustainable. Some of them were struggling because getting land back did not automatically repair everything that had broken in the years it was gone. A few had not come back at all, had built lives somewhere else, and decided to stay there, taking a cash settlement instead of the land itself. None of it was clean. None of it was the complete restoration that the words justice served implied. It was the partial, imperfect, real version of things getting better, which was, Eleanor had concluded, the only version that actually existed. "Clara finished it," Gideon said. He said it quietly, looking at the table. "In the end, everything she started." "Yes," Eleanor said. "She did." He looked up. He had the expression he sometimes had in the mornings, when the light came in flat and clear and the day hadn't put its weight on him yet. The expression of a man who had come through something and was still, periodically, surprised to find himself on the other side of it. "You finished it," he said. "To be accurate." "We finished it," Eleanor said. "All of us, including a 15-year-old boy in a blizzard." He nodded. The near smile. They sat there in the morning kitchen, and outside the window the summer valley moved through its ordinary motions, the hands coming out of the bunkhouse, Owen leading horses to the water trough, One of the younger children hollering something at another about something that was probably not worth hollering about. And Eleanor drank her coffee and thought about something she'd been thinking about on and off for months. She'd spent most of her adult life surviving, not dramatically, not in the frontier story sense of the word, though the past year had added some of that, but in the ordinary grinding sense of keeping things going, keeping children fed, keeping the arithmetic of need and resource from going completely underwater. Survival had been the work, and she'd been good at it, and it had cost her the capacity to think much beyond it. What was strange now, and it was strange she didn't dress it up as anything else, was that survival was no longer the primary task. The children were safe. The ranch was solvent. The legal situation was resolved. The valley was becoming something better than it had been. What came after surviving was something she was still learning to inhabit. It felt sometimes like a room she'd never been in before, and she kept standing in the doorway trying to work out where the furniture was supposed to go. She didn't think she'd ever be someone who rested easily. She didn't think Gideon was either. They were probably going to find things to fix for the rest of their lives, because that was who they both were. And maybe that was fine. Maybe that was, in fact, the point. You didn't build something worth having by stopping. You built it by finding the next thing and the thing after that. Not out of restlessness, but out of the specific kind of love that insists on making things better than they are. Clara Cross had known that. She'd known it well enough to die for it, and Eleanor had thought about that, and had decided that the way to honor it was not to be careful and cautious and grateful to still be standing. The way to honor it was to keep going in the same direction Clara had been moving. She would. They would. That was the thing she'd learned. In the 6 months since the tin box and the trial and the long, slow work of 43 land reversals. Not a lesson she could have been told in advance. The kind of thing you only understood by living it. That belonging was not a thing you found. It was not a place you arrived at, or a person who gave it to you, or a moment when something clicked into place, and you were suddenly, finally, home. It was the thing you built. Day by day, ordinary conversation by ordinary conversation, child by child settling into their place in a household that had been strange and was now familiar. Argument by argument resolved. Morning by morning sitting at the same table. It was the accumulated weight of all of it, the work of it, unglamorous, imperfect, real. Eleanor had come to Blackstone Valley with 9 children and $4.32, and no guarantee that any of it would hold. She had not come here looking for belonging. She had come here looking for survival. What she had found was considerably harder, and considerably more permanent, and considerably more hers. "What are you thinking about?" Gideon asked. She looked at him across the table. This man she'd known for 6 months. This house that was learning her weight the way houses do. These mountains visible from every window. "About belonging," she said. "About how long it takes to build something you can actually stand on." He thought about that for a moment. "Longer than you think it will," he said. "Yes," she said, "and worth it." Outside, one of the children started laughing. She couldn't tell which one, only that it was one of the younger ones. The laugh too high and unguarded for anyone old enough to have learned self-consciousness. It went on for a moment, and then another voice joined it, and then a third, and Eleanor sat with her coffee and listened to her children laughing on a summer morning in a valley that was becoming, slowly and imperfectly, what it should always have been. She was still learning in the room. She thought she probably always would be. That was all right. She had time.